Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep, so before we start I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In 2014, one of the most shocking and tragic crimes to occur in Asia was the murder of a young woman in the bustling metropolis of Seoul, South Korea. The perpetrator, identified as Lee Jae-hyun, was a 29-year-old man with a seemingly ordinary life. He had grown up in a middle-class neighborhood and was known to be quiet, reserved, and somewhat introverted. Lee worked as a software engineer for a small company, where he kept mostly to himself. His colleagues described him as intelligent but distant, never really forming close relationships with anyone at the office. But beneath this unassuming exterior, there was a darker side to Lee, a side that would eventually surface with devastating consequences. Lee had struggled with mental health issues for many years. He had experienced bouts of depression and anxiety since his late teens, but he had never sought proper treatment. His isolation only deepened as he grew older, and despite his attempts to maintain a facade of normalcy, he found himself overwhelmed by feelings of inadequacy and rage. It was in the summer of 2014 that Lee's mental state began to deteriorate further. He had recently been in a short-term relationship with a woman who had since ended things, leaving Lee heartbroken and angry. He took the breakup very hard, feeling as though his entire life had been upended. In the weeks that followed, he grew more and more withdrawn, spending long hours alone in his apartment, brooding over his thoughts. His friends and family noticed the change in his demeanor, but didn't think much of it at first. However, to Lee, the end of the relationship marked the tipping point. He became obsessed with the idea of being rejected and unimportant, fueling a growing hatred toward those he perceived as having a better life than he did. On the evening of August 13, 2014, Lee's rage came to a head. He had been following the young woman, Seo Eun-ji, for weeks. She was a college student at a prestigious university in Seoul, known for her beauty, intelligence, and vibrant personality. She had a wide circle of friends, and by all accounts, she had a bright future ahead of her. To Lee, however, she represented everything he felt he could never have: success, beauty, and happiness. He convinced himself that she was the cause of all his misery, even though they had never met before. His fixation on her grew as he began to lurk around her university campus, watching her from a distance. Lee's obsession culminated on that fateful evening, when he decided to confront Seo Eun-ji. He followed her as she left the university library and walked toward a nearby subway station. She was alone, and she didn't notice Lee trailing behind her. He approached her near an alleyway, a place where few people were around at that time of night. Without warning, he grabbed her from behind, pulling her into the alley. Seo Eun-ji screamed for help, but her voice was muffled by the noise of the bustling city around them. Lee's anger, which had been building up for months, consumed him entirely. He violently attacked her, stabbing her multiple times with a knife he had brought with him. The details of the attack were gruesome and chilling. As Lee stood over her lifeless body, covered in blood, he felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had taken control in a way that had eluded him for years. The release of his anger, the feeling of power, was overwhelming. He didn't regret what he had done, not in that moment. Instead, he felt numb, almost relieved. It wasn't until he heard the distant sound of sirens approaching that reality began to set in. Panic slowly crept in as he realized the consequences of his actions. Lee fled the scene, leaving Seo Eun-ji's body behind. He took off into the dark streets of Seoul, hoping to disappear into the night. But as he walked through the city, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that followed him. He had committed murder. He had taken the life of an innocent woman, and now his life would be forever changed. The news of Seo Eun-ji's murder spread quickly throughout the city. Her death was not just a tragedy. It was a senseless act of violence that seemed impossible to comprehend. The fact that she had been a complete stranger to her attacker only made the crime more chilling. In the days that followed, the police launched a massive investigation into the murder. Seo Eun-ji's family, devastated by the loss, pleaded for justice for their daughter. Her parents described her as a hard-working and kind-hearted young woman with a bright future, and they couldn't understand how someone could take her life so brutally. The investigation into the murder took several days, as the police worked tirelessly to gather evidence and piece together the circumstances surrounding Seo Eun-ji's death. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras revealed a man following her as she walked alone, and from that footage, the police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect. Witnesses who had seen the attack provided additional information that helped to narrow down the search. Eventually, on August 17, 2014, Lee Jae-hyun was apprehended in a small apartment on the outskirts of Seoul. He had been hiding out, trying to lay low, but his guilt and paranoia had led him to make a mistake. He had been spotted by someone who recognized him from the surveillance footage and alerted the authorities. When the police arrived at his apartment, Lee was arrested without resistance. He made no attempt to flee, and when questioned about the murder, he confessed to the crime. "I had to do it," he said quietly during his interrogation. "She had everything I didn't. She was perfect, and I was nothing." The confession sent shockwaves through the investigation team. They had never imagined that a seemingly ordinary man would be capable of such violence, driven by jealousy and an obsessive fixation. Lee's motive was clear: his feelings of rejection, his mental health issues, and his inability to cope with the breakup had led him to target an innocent person, someone he believed represented everything he could never have. The tragedy of Seo Eun-ji's death wasn't just the loss of a life. It was the stark reminder of the dangers of untreated mental illness, obsession, and isolation. Lee Jae-hyun's trial began later that year, and his defense team tried to argue that he had been suffering from severe psychological distress at the time of the murder. They cited his history of depression and social withdrawal as mitigating factors, hoping to reduce his sentence. However, the prosecution countered, arguing that Lee had planned the murder, and that his actions were not the result of an uncontrollable outburst, but rather a premeditated act of violence. In the end, Lee was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Seo Eun-ji's family, the conviction brought little comfort. Their daughter's life had been taken too soon, and the man responsible would never be able to undo the pain he had caused. But they found some solace in the fact that justice had been served. The tragedy of Seo Eun-ji's death would remain with them forever, but they also hoped that her story would serve as a reminder of the importance of mental health awareness and the need to address issues of isolation and anger before they spiral into something more dangerous. As for Lee Jae-hyun, his life was irreparably changed. He would spend the rest of his days in prison, haunted by the memory of his crime and the life he had taken. His story was one of deep sadness, a man lost in his own pain, consumed by feelings of inadequacy and bitterness. He had taken the life of someone who had done nothing wrong, someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And in the end, there were no winners. Only the grief of a family torn apart and a community forever scarred by the violence of one man's obsession. In the days following Lee Jae-hyun's arrest, the city of Seoul was in a state of shock. The murder of Seo Eun-ji had left a deep scar on the community. For the people who knew her, her friends, classmates, and even strangers who had heard of her tragic end, there was a lingering sense of unease. The fact that the killer was someone entirely unknown to the victim made the crime all the more disturbing. In the wake of her death, there were calls for increased vigilance, more support for mental health services, and a deeper examination of the role that isolation, loneliness, and untreated psychological issues played in driving people to such extremes. Seo Eun-ji had been a student at one of Seoul's most prestigious universities, majoring in economics. A bright, young woman with an infectious smile and an endless optimism about the future, she had been loved by everyone who knew her. Friends spoke of her dedication to her studies, her compassionate nature, and her ability to always make others laugh. She had recently been offered an internship with a top firm, and her future seemed to be filled with endless opportunities. Her parents, who had always supported her dreams, had seen in her the embodiment of hard work and promise. They were proud of the woman she had become, and they never imagined that their daughter's life would be stolen in such a violent and senseless manner. But as the investigation unfolded and the full scope of Lee Jae-hyun's obsession with Seo Eun-ji came to light, many began to question how someone like him could have fallen through the cracks of society. Lee's mental health history was eventually revealed to the public. He had been battling depression since his late teens, yet had never sought the help he so desperately needed. In interviews, people close to him spoke of his tendency to withdraw from social circles and his difficulty in forming meaningful relationships. He had never been violent, but he had often expressed a deep sense of bitterness and resentment, particularly when it came to his inability to connect with others. Despite the growing awareness of Lee's mental health struggles, there was little sympathy for him in the court of public opinion. The fact that he had targeted an innocent woman, a complete stranger, seemed to weigh heavily on the minds of the people of Seoul. Many people, including mental health professionals, were quick to point out that his depression and social isolation did not justify his actions. Mental illness, while a serious issue, was not an excuse for the cold-blooded murder of another human being. And while there was a sense of understanding about the pressures Lee had faced in his life, there was no mistaking the fact that his obsessive behavior had crossed a line from mere frustration to horrific violence. Throughout the trial, Lee's defense lawyers attempted to argue that he had been suffering from severe psychological distress at the time of the murder, hoping that his mental state would mitigate the severity of his punishment. They presented expert testimony from psychologists who claimed that Lee had been experiencing a delusional obsession with Seo Eun-ji, believing that she had somehow wronged him by existing in a way he could never achieve. They painted him as a man who had lost control of his emotions and actions due to a combination of depression, rejection, and alienation. However, the prosecution countered with a compelling argument. They pointed out that Lee's actions were not a spontaneous outburst of uncontrollable rage, but rather a coldly calculated decision to end the life of someone he viewed as an obstacle to his own self-worth. They also highlighted the fact that Lee had stalked Seo Eun-ji for weeks, meticulously planning the attack, before executing it in the dark, secluded alley. This, they argued, demonstrated that the murder was premeditated, not a crime of passion. As the trial continued, the stark contrast between Lee's actions and the vibrant life of Seo Eun-ji became all too apparent. The court heard testimony from her family and friends, who spoke of her boundless ambition, her kindness, and her unwavering desire to help others. They described a young woman who had everything to live for, a bright future, a loving family, and friends who adored her. And yet, it was all ripped away in an instant by a man who felt entitled to take what he believed was rightfully his. For Seo Eun-ji's parents, the trial was an agonizing experience. Each day, they listened to the details of their daughter's murder, reliving the nightmare they had endured since the moment they had learned of her death. They could hardly fathom how someone like Lee Jae-hyun, a man they had never known, could have destroyed their daughter's life so completely. But as the trial progressed, they began to find a sense of resolution in the pursuit of justice. Although they would never have their daughter back, they took solace in knowing that her killer would be held accountable for his actions. The courtroom became a place of intense emotional conflict as both sides presented their cases. The defense attempted to paint Lee as a victim of his own mental health struggles, while the prosecution focused on the chilling coldness with which he had taken Seo Eun-ji's life. As the case unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a murder trial. It was a reflection of the complexities of mental health, obsession, and the dangers of unaddressed emotional turmoil. Throughout the process, Lee himself remained distant, offering little in the way of remorse. His expression, often blank and emotionless, contrasted sharply with the pain that was visible on the faces of Seo Eun-ji's family. He did not seem to grasp the gravity of what he had done, nor did he express any genuine sorrow for the life he had taken. Instead, his responses were largely mechanical, as though he were disconnected from the reality of the situation. At the conclusion of the trial, the judge issued a sentence of life in prison for Lee Jae-hyun, a decision that was met with mixed reactions. Some believed that the sentence was too lenient, considering the brutality of the crime. Others argued that his mental health issues should have been given more weight in the decision. But ultimately, the ruling seemed to offer a sense of closure for Seo Eun-ji's family, even if it could not undo the damage that had been done. For Seoul, the murder of Seo Eun-ji was a stark reminder of the hidden dangers of isolation and untreated mental illness. It exposed the fragile boundary between ordinary lives and the darkness that can emerge when someone is left to suffer in silence. As the city moved forward, discussions about mental health, social isolation, and the importance of early intervention gained momentum. And while the wounds left by Seo Eun-ji's death would never fully heal, her story served as a catalyst for change, a call to ensure that the lives of others would not be stolen in the same way. As the dust settled after the trial, the city of Seoul continued to grapple with the haunting memory of Seo Eun-ji's death. The tragedy had left a deep scar on both her family and the community. It had revealed uncomfortable truths about the hidden struggles of those suffering from mental health issues and the devastating consequences that could arise when those struggles went untreated. In the months following the trial, discussions about mental health awareness became more prevalent in South Korea, with many people questioning how society had failed both Lee Jae-hyun and Seo Eun-ji. For Seo Eun-ji's family, the pain of her loss never truly faded. They continued to live with the emptiness left behind by their daughter, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in a world that no longer felt the same. Her parents, who had once seen a bright future for their daughter, now found themselves consumed with grief. They had lost a child they had cherished and nurtured, and no amount of justice could bring her back. In private moments, her mother would hold on to her daughter's belongings, the books she had been reading, the clothes she had worn, the trinkets she had collected during her travels, and wish that she could turn back time. No parent should ever have to bury their child, and yet, the reality of their situation was inescapable. Seo Eun-ji's friends, too, struggled to cope with the loss. They had known her as a vibrant, intelligent young woman who was always there for them in times of need. To them, the tragedy seemed senseless. How could such a bright life be cut short by the violent actions of a man who had never even known her? They gathered at her memorial, sharing stories and photographs, trying to hold on to the memory of her while acknowledging the pain of her absence. The students at her university held vigils in her honor, lighting candles and writing messages of love and remembrance. Many of them were inspired by her commitment to her education and her desire to make a positive impact on the world. As they remembered her life, they also found themselves reflecting on the impact of violence, obsession, and mental illness. It became clear that this was not just a loss for her family. It was a loss for everyone who had known her, a loss for a community that had been shaken by the senselessness of it all. While the immediate aftermath of the trial saw some attempts at change, the larger conversation about mental health in South Korea was slow to evolve. Mental illness, though increasingly recognized as a serious issue, still carried a heavy stigma in many parts of society. People who struggled with mental health were often reluctant to seek help, fearing judgment and discrimination. This cultural barrier to treatment was something that many advocates for mental health awareness fought against in the years that followed. The tragedy of Seo Eun-ji's murder highlighted the need for a more open dialogue about mental health, as well as a deeper understanding of the risks associated with untreated conditions. But despite these calls for change, the stigma persisted, and many people continued to suffer in silence. As for Lee Jae-hyun, his life behind bars was marked by the isolation he had once chosen, but now could not escape. Though he had confessed to his crime, his actions were far from fully understood. Was he simply a product of his own mental health struggles, a man overwhelmed by emotions he could not process? Or was he a cold-blooded killer who had premeditated the murder of an innocent person? The lines between the two remained blurred, and the complexities of his case continued to challenge mental health professionals, lawyers, and the general public alike. In prison, Lee was provided with psychiatric care, though his progress was slow. He often remained withdrawn, showing little remorse for his actions. His isolation mirrored the feelings of detachment he had experienced before the crime, as though he had once again retreated into a shell of his own making. Some questioned whether Lee would ever fully come to terms with what he had done. Could a man who had taken another's life ever truly understand the gravity of his actions? Or was he doomed to remain a prisoner of his own mind, trapped by delusions and resentment? Others believed that he might never be able to escape the guilt that would inevitably haunt him. Either way, it seemed that Lee's future was one of quiet reflection, far removed from the life he had once envisioned for himself. In the end, Lee's case became a tragic symbol of the dangers of unchecked mental health issues, as well as a stark reminder of the devastation that could unfold when someone's deep-seated pain manifested in violent ways. But it was also a call for society to reevaluate its approach to mental health, particularly in a country like South Korea, where traditional values and cultural norms often discouraged open discussions about emotional well-being. Seo Eun-ji's death was a tragic reminder that mental illness, whether recognized or ignored, could lead to catastrophic outcomes. Her life was a testament to the potential for greatness in everyone, and the violence that took her life was a reminder that even the most promising futures could be extinguished in an instant by the hand of someone struggling with demons they could not control. Though Seo Eun-ji's family and friends could never fully heal from the pain of her loss, they found solace in the memory of her warmth, her intelligence, and her kindness. She was more than the tragedy that had defined her death. She was a young woman with a bright future, and it was her memory that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And in the years to come, they hoped that her story, one of ambition, promise, and love, would inspire others to address their mental health before it was too late. Seo Eun-ji's life had been cut short, but her legacy, one of resilience and compassion, would live on in the hearts of those who had known her. And perhaps most importantly, her story would continue to serve as a reminder of the need for compassion, understanding, and intervention when it came to mental health, before another tragedy could unfold. Story 02. Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist with a history of racist beliefs, walked into the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, on the evening of June 17, 2015. With his pale complexion, bowl-cut hair, and a cold, emotionless stare, he appeared out of place among the congregation. But no one suspected the horror he was about to unleash. For over an hour, Roof sat quietly among the church members, listening as they discussed scripture in their regular Bible study session. The church, one of the oldest African American congregations in the United States, had always been a place of refuge and faith, a sanctuary for those seeking solace and community. That night, however, its walls would bear witness to an unspeakable act of hatred. At approximately 9:05 p.m., Roof, who had been pretending to be just another participant, suddenly stood up, pulled out a .45 caliber Glock pistol, and opened fire on the unsuspecting worshippers. Chaos erupted as gunshots echoed through the church hall. People screamed, some dove to the floor, while others instinctively reached for their loved ones. Within minutes, 9 innocent lives were taken, including the church's senior pastor, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was also a state senator. Survivors would later recall Roof standing over his victims, reloading his weapon multiple times, and spewing hateful, racist rhetoric. "You're taking over our country," he reportedly said before firing at his next target. Despite the carnage, one woman survived by pretending to be dead, while another was intentionally spared so she could tell the world what happened, as Roof chillingly put it. He then fled the scene, leaving behind a shattered community and a nation that would soon grapple with the true depths of racial hatred still present in America. Authorities launched an immediate manhunt, scouring surveillance footage and eyewitness testimonies to track down the shooter. The next morning, Roof was arrested nearly 250 miles away in Shelby, North Carolina, following a tip-off from a concerned citizen. His capture marked the beginning of a legal battle that would reignite national conversations about racism, gun violence, and the enduring scars of America's past. As he sat in police custody, chilling details about his motivations emerged. Roof had meticulously planned his attack, even posing with Confederate flags and writing a racist manifesto that he later posted online. He had hoped his actions would start a race war. Instead, they united a grieving nation in a call for change. Though, for the families of the victims, no justice could ever bring back their loved ones. Of all the horrific details that emerged in the aftermath of the Charleston church shooting, perhaps the most disturbing was how meticulously Dylan Roof had planned his crime. This was no impulsive act of violence. It was a calculated massacre, driven by deep-seated racist ideology that had been festering for years. Investigators quickly uncovered Roof's digital footprint, revealing a disturbing pattern of radicalization. His personal website, littered with white supremacist propaganda, showcased his obsession with racial division. He had spent months researching historic race-related crimes, including previous mass shootings and acts of racial violence. In a chilling manifesto he had written before the attack, he detailed his belief that white people were being systematically oppressed, and that it was his duty to take a stand. Roof had chosen the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church for a reason. Founded in 1816, it was not just any church. It was a symbol of black resilience and strength, a place where civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., had once spoken. Roof saw it as the perfect target for his twisted ideology. He had scouted the church in the weeks leading up to the shooting, familiarizing himself with its schedule, ensuring he would strike when the most people would be present. As law enforcement pieced together his movements, they discovered that the weapon he used, a .45 caliber Glock handgun, had been legally purchased 2 months earlier, despite his prior criminal record. A background check should have flagged him, preventing the sale, but a clerical error allowed Roof to buy the gun without issue. This revelation sparked national outrage, fueling an ongoing debate about gun control laws and systemic failures that allow dangerous individuals to arm themselves so easily. In the days following the attack, Charleston was gripped by mourning and disbelief. Outside the church, an impromptu memorial formed, flowers, candles, handwritten notes, and prayers left by people of all backgrounds, united in grief. The names of the victims were spoken with reverence. Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tawanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, and Myra Thompson. 9 innocent lives taken in an act of pure hatred. But even amid the overwhelming sorrow, something extraordinary happened. The families of the victims, just days after the massacre, stood in court and addressed Roof directly during his bond hearing. Instead of the rage or vengeance one might expect, they spoke words of forgiveness. "You took something precious from me," said Nadine Collier, whose mother, Ethel Lance, had been killed. "But I forgive you." It was a moment that stunned the nation. For many, it was an unfathomable display of grace. For others, it was a testament to the strength of the very community Roof had sought to destroy. The massacre was meant to incite a race war, but instead, it brought people together in defiance of hate. However, the conversation didn't end with grief and forgiveness. The attack ignited a nationwide debate about racism in America, particularly regarding the Confederate flag, a symbol Roof had frequently posed within photographs. In the weeks that followed, pressure mounted to remove the Confederate battle flag from South Carolina's State House grounds. For decades, efforts to take it down had been blocked by lawmakers who insisted it was a symbol of heritage, not hate. But now, after Charleston's tragedy, the argument was no longer tenable. On July 10, 2015, less than a month after the shooting, the Confederate flag was finally lowered from the State House grounds in a historic moment witnessed by thousands. To some, it was a step forward. To others, it was merely a symbolic gesture that did little to address the deeper issues of systemic racism that had led to the attack in the first place. Meanwhile, Roof remained in federal custody, showing no remorse for his actions. In fact, he was unrepentant. Investigators reported that during interrogations, he calmly admitted to the killings, stating that he had no regrets, and that he would do it again if given the chance. His lack of remorse was chilling, solidifying the image of a man consumed by hatred, indifferent to the suffering he had caused. As the legal proceedings moved forward, federal prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty. It was an unusual move, as federal death sentences were rarely pursued, but in this case, officials argued that Roof's crimes were so heinous that the harshest punishment was warranted. Roof's defense team, in contrast, attempted to negotiate a plea deal that would spare him from execution in exchange for life in prison. However, Roof, in an act of arrogance or delusion, refused to cooperate, insisting on representing himself in court. This decision set the stage for a trial that would not only determine Roof's fate, but also force the nation to confront its deep-rooted racial wounds. The coming months would reveal even more about Roof's twisted ideology, the failures that had allowed him to carry out his crime, and the ongoing struggle between justice and forgiveness in the wake of tragedy. As Dylann Roof's trial approached, the weight of his actions continued to ripple across the country. His calculated attack on the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church had not only devastated the families of the victims, but had also reignited painful discussions about the deep-seated racial tensions that still plagued America. The courtroom was not just a place where Roof would answer for his crimes. It became a stage where the nation would once again be forced to examine its conscience. Despite being offered experienced legal representation, Roof made the shocking decision to represent himself during the trial. Many saw this as a deliberate attempt to manipulate the proceedings, a way for him to control his own narrative and further push his white supremacist beliefs. Legal experts were baffled by his choice, noting that it would only hurt his chances of avoiding the death penalty. Some believed Roof refused legal counsel out of arrogance, convinced that he could use the trial to spread his ideology. Others saw it as an act of defiance, one last effort to display dominance over a system he had openly despised. In November 2016, more than a year after the massacre, jury selection began. Hundreds of potential jurors were screened, as the court sought individuals who could fairly weigh the evidence while withstanding the intense emotional weight of the case. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Department of Justice, sought the death penalty, arguing that Roof's crimes were among the most heinous acts of domestic terrorism in recent history. On December 7, 2016, the trial officially began. Survivors of the attack took the stand, recounting the horrors of that night in vivid, heartbreaking detail. They spoke of the moment Roof pulled out his gun, of the deafening sound of gunfire, of the desperate cries for help. One survivor, Felicia Sanders, described how she had hidden under a table with her 11-year-old granddaughter, whispering for her to stay silent as Roof executed the others in the room. He was cold, calculated. He wanted to make sure there were no survivors, she testified. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Roof remained emotionless throughout the proceedings. He refused to cross-examine witnesses. He presented no defense. In a bizarre, unsettling statement, he told the jury, "I still feel like I had to do it." His lack of remorse only reinforced the prosecution's argument that he was a danger to society and deserved the harshest punishment possible. The prosecution introduced Roof's own writings as evidence, including his chilling manifesto, where he detailed his belief that black people were inferior and that violence was the only way to preserve white dominance. They showed the court pictures of Roof posing with the Confederate flag, his expression one of pride and defiance. They presented records of his internet searches, proving that he had meticulously planned the attack for months. In less than 2 hours, the jury reached a verdict: guilty on all 33 federal charges, including hate crimes and obstruction of religious freedom. The next phase of the trial would determine whether he would receive the death penalty or life in prison without parole. During the sentencing phase, families of the victims once again took the stand. They spoke not of vengeance, but of loss, of the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments they would never share with their loved ones again. They spoke of the pain Roof had inflicted, not just on them, but on an entire community. But despite their grief, many of the victims' families still chose to offer forgiveness. This confounded many observers. How could they forgive the man who had slaughtered their mothers, fathers, siblings, and children in cold blood? Yet, to those who knew the church and its teachings, it was a reflection of faith, of a belief in justice beyond earthly courts. The defense attempted to argue that Roof was mentally ill, that his radicalization had been fueled by isolation and online extremism. But the jury was unmoved. Roof himself rejected any claim of mental illness, stating plainly, "There's nothing wrong with me psychologically." On January 10, 2017, Dylann Roof was sentenced to death. He became the first person in U.S. history to receive the federal death penalty for a hate crime. Yet even as the sentence was read aloud, Roof remained emotionless, showing no reaction to the fate he had been given. His conviction was seen as justice, but it did not erase the pain of what had been lost. The Charleston community continued to mourn, holding vigils and services in honor of the victims. Emmanuel AME Church, though scarred by the tragedy, remained standing, its doors open, its congregation determined to persevere in the face of hate. In the years that followed, the case continued to serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked extremism. Roof's attack led to a broader national reckoning, pushing conversations about gun control, white supremacist radicalization, and the enduring impact of racism in America. Though the Confederate flag was removed from the South Carolina State House, many argued that symbols alone were not enough, that real change required confronting the deeper societal issues that had allowed Roof's hatred to fester. Today, Roof remains on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He has exhausted multiple appeals, and barring any last-minute legal maneuvers, he will eventually face execution. Yet, for many, the true measure of justice is not found in his sentence, but in the resilience of the Charleston community, their ability to stand together, to rebuild, and to prove that love and unity are stronger than hate. Even in the face of unimaginable loss, the message that emerged from Charleston was clear. Hatred may take lives, but it will never break the human spirit. Story 3. On the evening of November 13, 2015, Paris was alive with its usual vibrancy. Cafés brimmed with patrons, music filled the air, and the Stade de France buzzed with the excitement of a friendly soccer match between France and Germany. Unbeknownst to the thousands enjoying their Friday night, a meticulously coordinated series of terrorist attacks was about to unfold, plunging the city into chaos and leaving an indelible scar on the nation's psyche. At approximately 9:20 p.m., the first signs of terror emerged. A suicide bomber detonated his explosive vest near Gate D of the Stade de France in Saint-Denis, a northern suburb of Paris. The blast reverberated through the stadium, causing momentary confusion among the spectators. Security personnel, initially uncertain of the explosion's origin, began to mobilize, but the match continued, with many attendees unaware of the gravity of the situation unfolding outside. Just minutes later, at 9:25 p.m., gunfire erupted in the heart of Paris. Armed assailants opened fire on the crowded terraces of Le Carillon, a popular café in the 10th arrondissement, before crossing the street to target Le Petit Cambodge, a Cambodian restaurant. The attackers fired indiscriminately, leaving a scene of devastation in their wake. As emergency services rushed to the area, reports of additional shootings and explosions began to surface, indicating a citywide assault. By 9:30 p.m., a second suicide bomber detonated near the Stade de France, intensifying the panic both inside and outside the venue. President François Hollande, who was attending the match, was swiftly evacuated as security forces grappled with the escalating crisis. The decision was made to allow the game to continue to prevent mass hysteria, but the atmosphere was thick with tension as news of the attacks began to spread among the crowd. Meanwhile, the attackers' rampage through Paris persisted. At 9:32 p.m., gunmen targeted Café Bon Bière and La Casa Nostra Pizzeria in the 11th arrondissement, again firing upon unsuspecting diners and passers-by. The assailants then moved to La Belle Équipe, a café on Rue de Charonne, where they unleashed a hail of bullets, resulting in numerous casualties. Each attack was executed with chilling precision, the assailants arriving in black vehicles, armed with assault rifles, and showing no mercy to their victims. The most harrowing of the night's events commenced at 9:40 p.m. at the Bataclan Theater, where the American rock band Eagles of Death Metal was performing to a sold-out audience of approximately 1,500 people. 3 attackers stormed the venue, opening fire and taking hostages. Concertgoers initially mistook the gunfire for pyrotechnics, but the horrifying reality quickly became apparent as bodies fell and chaos ensued. The assailants, armed with AK-47 rifles and explosive belts, corralled survivors towards the stage, creating a human shield and positioning themselves for a prolonged standoff with law enforcement. As the siege at the Bataclan continued, a third explosion occurred near the Stade de France at 9:53 p.m., marking the final blast in the series of attacks. The coordinated nature of the assaults became evident, with multiple teams of terrorists striking simultaneously at different locations, maximizing fear and confusion. Emergency services were stretched thin, hospitals activated mass casualty protocols, and the streets of Paris were filled with the sounds of sirens and the sight of flashing lights. Inside the Bataclan, hostages endured a nightmarish ordeal. The attackers shouted extremist slogans, condemned France's military actions in Syria and Iraq, and methodically executed captives. Some concertgoers managed to escape through emergency exits or by feigning death among the fallen. Survivors later recounted the assailants' calm demeanor and the calculated nature of their brutality. The police, upon arriving at the scene, faced a delicate situation, needing to neutralize the terrorists while minimizing harm to the hostages. At 12:20 a.m., after hours of terror, French security forces launched an assault on the Bataclan. Elite tactical units stormed the theater, engaging the attackers in a fierce gun battle. 2 of the terrorists detonated their explosive vests as police closed in, while the third was shot dead before he could trigger his device. The operation resulted in the liberation of the remaining hostages, but the toll was devastating. 90 people lost their lives in the theater, making it the deadliest of the night's attacks. In total, the November 13th attacks claimed 130 lives and left over 350 injured, marking one of the deadliest days in France since World War II. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, claimed responsibility, stating that the assaults were retaliation for French airstrikes against ISIL targets in the Middle East. The attackers were identified as a mix of French and Belgian nationals, some of whom had traveled to Syria and returned to Europe undetected, exploiting the refugee crisis and existing security gaps. The aftermath of the attacks saw France declaring a state of emergency, implementing heightened security measures, and conducting numerous raids to dismantle terrorist networks. The events of that fateful night not only reshaped France's domestic policies, but also had profound implications for international counterterrorism strategies, immigration debates, and the global fight against extremist ideologies. As Paris mourned, the world stood in solidarity, with landmarks across the globe illuminated in the colors of the French flag. The resilience of the Parisians, their commitment to liberty, and the universal condemnation of the attacks underscored a collective resolve to confront and overcome the scourge of terrorism. In the aftermath of the November 13, 2015 Paris attacks, France found itself in a state of mourning, shock, and deep introspection. The sheer scale of the violence, the deliberate targeting of civilians, and the ruthless coordination of the attacks made it clear that this was not an isolated incident. It was a calculated act of terror designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. As dawn broke over Paris on November 14th, the streets bore the scars of the previous night's horror. Bloodstains marked the pavement outside cafes and restaurants. Bullet holes riddled walls and shattered glass lay scattered across sidewalks. The Bataclan, once a place of music and celebration, had become a symbol of tragedy. Survivors recounted their experiences to the media, their voices trembling as they described the sheer terror of being trapped inside a concert hall where death surrounded them. Some spoke of playing dead to avoid the gunman's attention, while others recalled the selfless acts of strangers who had shielded one another from bullets. The scale of the attacks prompted an immediate response from the French government. President François Hollande, in an emergency address to the nation, declared a state of emergency, the first time such a measure had been taken on this scale in decades. He called the attacks an act of war carried out by a terrorist army, and within hours, France's military launched retaliatory airstrikes on Islamic State, ISIL, strongholds in Syria. Security forces were placed on high alert, borders were tightened, and thousands of police officers were deployed across the country to prevent further incidents. The investigation into the attacks unfolded at an unprecedented pace. Authorities quickly identified the attackers, a group of 9 men, most of whom were French or Belgian nationals with known extremist ties. They had carefully planned their assault from Belgium, using encrypted messaging apps to coordinate their movements. Investigators discovered that several of them had traveled to Syria in previous years to receive training from ISIL, exploiting gaps in European security to return undetected. One of the key figures in the attacks was Abdelhamid Abaoud, a Belgian extremist believed to be the mastermind behind the operation. Surveillance footage placed him in Paris on the night of the attacks, and intelligence reports suggested that he had managed to evade capture despite being one of Europe's most wanted terrorists. His ability to orchestrate such a devastating attack within the heart of the European Union raised urgent questions about the effectiveness of counterterrorism measures. Meanwhile, the search for surviving accomplices intensified. Just days after the attacks, French police launched a massive raid in the Paris suburb of Saint-Denis, acting on intelligence that Abaoud and other suspects were hiding in an apartment. In the early hours of November 18th, heavily armed officers stormed the building. A fierce gunfight erupted, lasting nearly 7 hours. A female suicide bomber, later identified as Abaoud's cousin, detonated her explosive vest as police closed in, killing herself instantly. Abaoud himself was shot and killed during the raid, his body barely recognizable due to the gunfire and explosion. With Abaoud dead, authorities continued their manhunt for the remaining perpetrators. One of the most wanted fugitives was Salah Abdeslam, the only surviving member of the group that carried out the attacks. Unlike his fellow attackers, he had fled Paris after the massacre, managing to evade capture for months despite being the subject of an international manhunt. He was eventually tracked down in Brussels in March 2016, where he was arrested in a dramatic raid by Belgian authorities. His capture provided a crucial breakthrough in understanding the logistics behind the attacks. In the wake of the attacks, Europe was forced to confront a stark reality. Terrorism had evolved. The Paris massacre exposed glaring weaknesses in intelligence sharing between European countries, particularly in tracking known extremists who moved freely across borders. It also raised serious concerns about radicalization, as many of the attackers had been born and raised in Europe, yet had been drawn into violent jihadist ideology. The attacks also reignited debates about immigration and security. Some politicians argued that the influx of refugees from war-torn regions like Syria posed a threat, pointing to reports that at least one of the attackers had entered Europe using a fake Syrian passport. Others countered that ISIL had deliberately sought to exploit fears about refugees to stoke division, emphasizing that the vast majority of those fleeing conflict were themselves victims of terrorism. Beyond politics, the psychological toll on the people of Paris was profound. The city, known for its resilience, struggled to come to terms with the scale of the violence. Many Parisians reported a lingering sense of unease, avoiding crowded public places and feeling wary of large gatherings. The sight of heavily armed soldiers patrolling the streets became the new normal, a constant reminder that the threat had not disappeared. Yet, even in the midst of grief and fear, there were moments of unity. Across France, candlelight vigils were held in honor of the victims. People gathered at Place de la République, leaving flowers, letters, and messages of solidarity. The phrase "Je suis Paris" spread across social media, mirroring the global outpouring of support that had followed the Charlie Hebdo attack earlier that year. One particularly moving moment came during a gathering outside the Bataclan, where a survivor placed a sign that read, "They wanted us to be afraid. Instead, we will sing louder." And indeed, in the weeks that followed, defiance took many forms. Concerts resumed, restaurants reopened, and the people of Paris refused to let fear dictate their lives. The investigation into the attacks continued for years, uncovering extensive terrorist networks that stretched across Europe. Several individuals who had provided logistical support to the attackers were arrested, and ISIL's ability to carry out large-scale operations in the West was significantly weakened due to intensified counterterrorism efforts. However, the scars left by that night were deep. For the families of the 130 victims, justice could never truly replace what had been taken. The legal proceedings against those involved in the attacks would go on for years, with some suspects facing trial in both France and Belgium. But beyond the courtroom, the November 13th attacks served as a sobering reminder of the global fight against extremism, the fragility of security, and the resilience of those who refused to be broken by terror. As France moved forward, the memory of that tragic night remained a solemn part of its history, a night when the City of Lights was momentarily darkened but never extinguished. As the months turned into years, the full impact of the November 13th, 2015, Paris attacks continued to unfold. The events of that night had forever changed the city, leaving scars not only on its people, but also on the very fabric of European security, counterterrorism policies, and international relations. In the immediate aftermath, French authorities intensified their efforts to dismantle terrorist networks operating within the country and across Europe. The government expanded its intelligence capabilities, increased funding for counterterrorism operations, and passed controversial security laws that granted law enforcement broader surveillance powers. The state of emergency initially declared by President François Hollande was extended multiple times, lasting until 2017. This led to thousands of police raids, house searches, and arrests, as authorities sought to prevent further attacks and uncover hidden extremist cells. One of the major revelations that emerged from the investigation was the extent to which the attackers had exploited weaknesses in European border security. Many of them had traveled between France, Belgium, and Syria using forged documents or under false identities. Some had even been flagged by intelligence agencies, but were not actively monitored due to resource limitations. This failure to track known extremists led to widespread criticism of European security cooperation and calls for a more unified intelligence sharing system between EU member states. In response, the European Union implemented stricter border controls and enhanced security measures at airports and train stations. The Schengen Agreement, which allowed passport-free travel across most of Europe, came under intense scrutiny, with some governments temporarily reinstating border checks. Counterterrorism experts warned, however, that while tightening borders could help, the greater challenge lay in addressing the radicalization of individuals already living within Europe. The issue of radicalization became a major focus in the years following the attacks. It became clear that many of the perpetrators had not been foreign operatives infiltrating France, but rather European citizens who had grown up in marginalized communities where they had become susceptible to extremist ideologies. Neighborhoods in cities like Brussels and Paris, where unemployment and social isolation were rampant, were identified as breeding grounds for radicalization. Governments across Europe introduced de-radicalization programs, working with local communities, religious leaders, and educators to prevent young people from being drawn into extremism. At the same time, France faced a significant challenge in managing its prison system, where radicalization was spreading at an alarming rate. Many convicted extremists were housed together, allowing them to recruit and spread their ideology among other inmates. Prison reforms were introduced to separate high-risk individuals from the general population, but the problem persisted, raising concerns about the long-term security risks posed by radicalized individuals upon their release. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against those involved in the attacks moved forward. The key surviving perpetrator, Salah Abdeslam, was captured in Belgium in March 2016 and later extradited to France to stand trial. His arrest was a major breakthrough, as he was the only attacker who had survived, and authorities hoped he could provide insight into the planning and execution of the attacks. However, during his trial, Abdeslam largely refused to cooperate, showing little remorse for his role in the massacre. Other individuals who had provided logistical support to the attackers also faced prosecution. Some had supplied weapons, while others had facilitated travel arrangements or provided safe houses. The trials, which stretched on for years, were closely followed by the victims' families, many of whom sought justice and closure. In 2022, after a lengthy trial, Abdeslam was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, marking one of the most severe sentences ever handed down in France. For the families of the victims, the legal process brought some sense of justice, but it could never undo the pain of their loss. Many survivors struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by the memories of that night. The psychological impact of the attacks was far-reaching, not only for those directly affected, but also for the broader French society. Fear of terrorism became deeply ingrained in the public consciousness, and the presence of heavily armed soldiers patrolling tourist sites, schools, and public events became a permanent fixture in daily life. Despite the trauma, the people of Paris refused to let fear define them. In the years that followed, the city rebuilt itself, and efforts were made to honor the memory of the victims. Memorials were erected at the sites of the attacks, including a plaque outside the Bataclan Theater, where mourners continued to leave flowers and messages of remembrance. Annual ceremonies were held, with moments of silence observed across France to commemorate the lives lost. The attacks also had a profound impact on France's political landscape. The rise of nationalist and anti-immigration rhetoric gained traction in the wake of the violence, with far-right politicians arguing for stricter immigration controls and harsher measures against radical Islam. Debates over religious expression, particularly the role of Islam in French society, became more contentious, fueling divisions within the country. At the same time, France remained committed to its values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. While the government took a hard stance on security, it also emphasized the importance of unity and resilience. In the years following the attacks, initiatives promoting cultural integration, interfaith dialogue, and community engagement were launched in an effort to bridge divides and prevent further radicalization. On an international level, the Paris attacks underscored the growing threat posed by ISIL and its ability to inspire attacks beyond the Middle East. In response, France intensified its military efforts against the terrorist group, conducting airstrikes in Syria and Iraq as part of a broader coalition led by the United States. These operations, combined with local ground offensives, ultimately led to the collapse of ISIL's self-proclaimed caliphate in 2019. However, even with ISIL's territorial defeat, the ideology that fueled the attacks remained a global concern. Counterterrorism agencies warned that the threat had evolved, with extremist groups shifting their tactics to inspire lone wolf attacks rather than large-scale coordinated operations. The use of social media for recruitment and radicalization became an ongoing challenge, requiring new strategies to combat online extremism. Looking back, the events of November 13, 2015, served as a defining moment in modern history, a tragic reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist in an open society, but also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The attacks sought to instill fear and division, but instead, they strengthened France's resolve to uphold its democratic values and fight against those who sought to destroy them. Today, as Paris continues to thrive, the memory of that dark night lives on, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a testament to the courage, unity, and determination of a city that refused to be broken. The victims are remembered not just in memorials, but in the unwavering spirit of those who continue to live their lives freely, refusing to let terror dictate their future. Story 4. In the early hours of September 4, 2015, a calculated and ruthless crime unfolded in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. At the center of this case was Dr. Kunasegaran Saidswaran, a military pathologist with deep ties to the medical and legal community. Beneath his professional exterior, however, lay a man capable of orchestrating a brutal murder to silence a voice that threatened him. Dr. Kunasegaran was a well-known figure in forensic pathology, responsible for conducting autopsies and handling sensitive cases for the government. He had spent years building his reputation, but behind the scenes, he was embroiled in corruption and misconduct. His illegal activities were under scrutiny, and the man leading the investigation against him was none other than Deputy Public Prosecutor Anthony Kevin Moret, a fearless and relentless prosecutor known for taking on high-profile corruption cases. Kevin Moret had spent decades in the Malaysian legal system, earning a reputation as an incorruptible force against crime and corruption. He had worked closely with the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission (MAC), pursuing cases that exposed deep-seated corruption among politicians, law enforcement, and professionals who abused their power. His latest case, involving Dr. Kunasigran, threatened to expose malpractice and corruption within the medical and judicial systems. The tension between them had been building for months. Dr. Kunasigran knew that if Moray proceeded with his prosecution, he would lose everything: his career, his wealth, and his freedom. Desperate to avoid conviction, he made a chilling decision. Kevin Moray had to be eliminated. On the morning of September 4th, 2015, Moray left his home in his government-issued Proton Perdana. As he drove towards his office in Putrajaya, a convoy of vehicles trailed him, their occupants following precise instructions. These men, hired by Dr. Kunasigran, had been tasked with carrying out the murder and ensuring that Moray disappeared without a trace. The ambush was swift and brutal. As Moray approached a quieter stretch of road, a vehicle rammed into his car, forcing him to stop. Within seconds, the assassins descended upon him, dragging him out of his vehicle. The struggle was brief. Moray, though a man of strong will, was outnumbered and overpowered. They forced him into another car, restraining him as they sped away from the scene. For days, Moray's sudden disappearance baffled investigators. His family, friends, and colleagues feared the worst. The Malaysian authorities launched a full-scale investigation, retracing his movements and examining surveillance footage. It quickly became apparent that his disappearance was not random. It was a targeted attack. The search intensified as authorities uncovered evidence linking Dr. Kunasigran to a group of criminals involved in carrying out the abduction. One by one, the hired killers were tracked down and arrested. Under pressure, they began to confess, revealing the horrifying details of what had happened to Moray after he was taken. According to their accounts, Moray had been taken to a secluded location where he was brutally murdered. His body was placed in a drum, which was then filled with cement in an attempt to permanently erase any evidence of the crime. The drum was later dumped into a swamp, a chilling effort to ensure that no one would ever find him. As investigators pieced together the truth, the weight of the crime became evident. This was not a random act of violence, but a meticulously planned execution carried out to silence a man who had dedicated his life to justice. The involvement of Dr. Kunasigran, a respected medical professional, added another layer of shock to the case. He had used his knowledge and connections to orchestrate a murder, believing that he could eliminate a threat and escape accountability. But the truth could not be buried. As authorities closed in, Dr. Kunasigran was arrested and charged with the murder of Kevin Moray. His downfall marked the beginning of a lengthy legal battle that would expose corruption and the lengths to which powerful individuals would go to protect themselves. The nation watched as the case unfolded, horrified by the sheer brutality of the crime. Kevin Moray, a man who had fought tirelessly for justice, had been betrayed and murdered in cold blood. Yet, in the end, his work would not be in vain. His death became a symbol of the ongoing fight against corruption in Malaysia, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, the pursuit of justice must never waver. The case of Kevin Moray's murder sent shockwaves through Malaysia. His sudden disappearance had initially left his colleagues, friends, and family in a state of anguish and confusion. But as the investigation gained momentum, the horrifying truth began to unravel, piece by piece, leading to a crime so cold and calculated that it exposed the darkest depths of corruption within the system. After the hired killers began confessing, authorities faced the daunting task of recovering Moray's remains. One of the arrested suspects led investigators to a remote swamp area in Subang Jaya, a district just outside Kuala Lumpur. There, partially submerged in muddy waters, they discovered a steel drum filled with hardened cement. Investigators, forensic teams, and emergency responders worked tirelessly to extract the drum, carefully chipping away at the concrete to reveal the remains inside. The condition of the body, encased in cement for days, made identification challenging. However, forensic specialists managed to retrieve DNA samples, and after extensive analysis, they confirmed what the entire nation had feared. This was indeed Kevin Moray. The discovery sent a wave of grief across the country. His murder was not just a tragedy for his family, but for Malaysia as a whole, as it underscored the grave dangers faced by those who dared to stand against corruption. With Moray's remains found, the focus shifted toward prosecuting those responsible. The hired assassins, one after another, provided detailed confessions, revealing how they had been contacted and paid to carry out the brutal act. Investigators learned that the plot had been in motion for weeks, carefully orchestrated by Dr. Soothes. Dr. Soothes, who once commanded respect in the medical and legal fields, had transformed into a desperate man willing to go to any lengths to protect himself. He had been under intense scrutiny due to an ongoing corruption case that Moray was prosecuting. The charges against him involved fraudulent medical reports, bribery, and abuse of power, offenses that carried severe penalties. If convicted, he faced the possibility of losing his medical license, his career, and his freedom. For months, he had tried to manipulate the legal system, using his influence to evade consequences. But Moray was relentless. Known for his integrity and dedication, Moray was unwilling to back down, refusing to be swayed by bribes or threats. His determination to see the case through left Dr. Soothes with only one option: to eliminate the man standing in his way. The investigation revealed that Dr. Soothes had hired multiple individuals to carry out different aspects of the crime. Some were tasked with monitoring Moray's movements, ensuring they knew his daily routine. Others were responsible for intercepting him on the road and executing the abduction. Once Moray was in their custody, they mercilessly tortured him before finally killing him. His body was then placed in the steel drum, which was filled with cement to make it nearly impossible to retrieve evidence. However, in their haste, the killers had made several mistakes. Surveillance footage showed Moray's car being followed by multiple vehicles on the morning of his disappearance. Witnesses recalled seeing a struggle near the location where Moray's car was later abandoned. Phone records traced back to the suspects showed suspicious calls between Dr. Soothes and his hired men in the hours leading up to and following the murder. These pieces of evidence painted a damning picture, one that the prosecution would later use in court to ensure justice was served. As the trial approached, public outrage intensified. Moray's murder was seen as an attack not just on one man, but on the very foundations of justice in Malaysia. The nation had long struggled with corruption at various levels, but this case proved just how far some were willing to go to silence those who sought the truth. The legal community mourned the loss of one of its most respected figures, while citizens questioned the safety of whistleblowers and prosecutors who dared to challenge the powerful. In the days following the discovery of Moray's body, thousands attended vigils in his honor. His colleagues spoke of his unwavering commitment to justice, recalling his tireless work ethic and fearless approach in handling sensitive cases. His family, devastated by his loss, demanded accountability and justice for the brutal manner in which he was taken from them. Meanwhile, behind bars, Dr. Soothes was beginning to realize the gravity of his mistake. His confidence, which had once led him to believe he could orchestrate the perfect crime, had crumbled under the weight of overwhelming evidence. The very legal system he had tried to manipulate was now closing in on him, preparing to make him answer for his sins. The trial was set to be one of the most significant in Malaysia's history. Prosecutors gathered every shred of evidence, determined to ensure that not only the hired killers, but also the mastermind behind the crime faced the full force of the law. As the court proceedings loomed, the people of Malaysia awaited justice for Kevin Moray, hoping that his death would not be in vain. The trial of Dr. Soothes and his accomplices began in earnest in late 2016, nearly a year after Kevin Moray's body was discovered. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public who were deeply invested in the outcome of this case. It was not just a trial of a man accused of murder. It was a trial for the integrity of the Malaysian justice system. The nation held its breath, hoping that this case would bring the truth to light and deliver justice for Kevin Moray. The prosecution team, led by one of Moray's former colleagues, painstakingly laid out the evidence against Dr. Soothes. They presented a chilling account of how he had plotted the murder with a cold and calculating mind, driven by fear and self-preservation. The evidence was overwhelming. Phone records showed numerous calls between Soothes and the men who had carried out the murder. Surveillance footage placed the suspects at the scene of Moray's abduction, and the confessions of the hired killers painted a detailed picture of the events leading up to and following the murder. The defense, on the other hand, sought to paint Dr. Soothes as a man caught up in a difficult situation, acting out of desperation and fear of losing everything. His legal team tried to argue that he was being framed, that the confessions of the killers were coerced, and that the evidence was circumstantial. However, their attempts to cast doubt on the case only seemed to further infuriate the public, who believed in the strength of the evidence presented against the accused. In the weeks that followed, the court heard testimonies from key witnesses, colleagues of Kevin Moret, law enforcement officials, and even experts in forensic pathology. One of the most poignant moments came when Moret's family members took the stand. His brother, Richard Moret, spoke of the pain of losing his elder sibling in such a brutal and senseless manner. He described Kevin as a man of integrity, whose commitment to fighting corruption was unwavering, even at the cost of his own safety. His family's emotional testimony resonated deeply with the jury and the public, reinforcing the idea that Kevin's death was not just a personal tragedy, but a national one. As the trial progressed, Dr. Kunasigaran remained largely stoic. His face betrayed little emotion, as if he was trying to maintain control over a situation he could no longer manage. However, those who knew him well could see the cracks in his facade, the moments when his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, the subtle tension in his posture as the evidence piled up against him. Finally, after months of legal wrangling, the trial came to a close. The defense made its final arguments, trying once again to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. But the damage had been done. The evidence was irrefutable. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the gravity of the crime and the role that Dr. Kunasigaran had played in orchestrating it. On February 22, 2017, the verdict was read aloud in court. Dr. Kunasigaran Satheswaran was found guilty of the murder of Kevin Moret. The court also convicted several of his accomplices, including the hired killers, who had played a direct role in the abduction and death of the prosecutor. Dr. Kunasigaran was sentenced to death by hanging, while his accomplices received varying sentences for their roles in the crime. The verdict sent shockwaves through the legal and medical communities. It was rare for a person of Dr. Kunasigaran's standing to be convicted of such a heinous crime, and even rarer for someone in his position to face the death penalty. For many, it was a symbol of the nation's commitment to upholding the law, no matter how powerful or influential the perpetrator might be. The verdict was a hard-fought victory for justice, but it also raised questions about the pervasive corruption that existed in various sectors of Malaysian society, and the lengths to which individuals would go to protect themselves from exposure. Dr. Kunasigaran's arrest and conviction sparked heated debates about corruption, accountability, and the safety of public figures who dared to challenge the status quo. For many, Kevin Moret's death was a wake-up call, a reminder that the fight against corruption is not without its dangers, and that the cost of seeking justice can sometimes be tragically high. But it was also a moment of reckoning, one that inspired reform and change in the Malaysian justice system. The aftermath of the trial was a turning point in the country's struggle against corruption. While the conviction of Dr. Kunasigaran brought some measure of closure to Kevin Moret's family and the public, it also marked the beginning of a broader conversation about the need for greater transparency, stronger protections for whistleblowers, and more effective systems for combating corruption at all levels of government and society. In the years that followed, Malaysia saw a wave of reform, with increasing efforts to root out corruption from all sectors. The case of Kevin Moret became a rallying cry for those fighting for a more just and transparent Malaysia, a country where the law could be relied upon to protect the innocent, no matter their station in life. For his family, friends, and colleagues, Kevin Moret would never be forgotten. His legacy as a dedicated public servant, a man who risked everything for the pursuit of justice, lived on. His death, while tragic, was not in vain. It sparked change, and it ensured that his fight for a better, more just Malaysia would be carried on by those who had known and admired him. Story 5. In 2015, a disturbing crime occurred in the bustling city of Fuzhou, Fujian Province, China, involving a young man named Wu Xiyu. Born on November 6, 1992, Wu came from a middle-class family and was a student at Peking University, one of China's most prestigious institutions. From the outside, Wu appeared to be a model student with a bright future ahead of him. However, beneath his academic achievements and outward success, a dark resentment was brewing. Wu's relationship with his mother, Xie Tianqin, had always been strained. Xie Tianqin was a strong-willed and ambitious woman, determined to provide her only son with the best opportunities in life. She worked tirelessly to support Wu's education and ensured that he attended one of the most elite universities in China. However, her devotion to her son's success came with a heavy cost. Over the years, Wu had grown to resent her relentless pursuit of his academic and personal success. He viewed her as overbearing and controlling, feeling that she had stifled his independence and placed immense pressure on him to meet her high expectations. Despite being in his early 20s and attending a prestigious university, Wu felt trapped by his mother's expectations. He became increasingly frustrated with the lack of freedom he believed she imposed on him, and his resentment toward her began to build. The emotional toll of their relationship had begun to manifest in Wu's personal life. He struggled with feelings of anger and helplessness, feeling that no matter what he achieved, it was never enough to satisfy his mother's insatiable demands. Over time, these feelings of frustration morphed into something darker. Wu felt as though his mother's constant presence in his life was a form of imprisonment, a barrier that prevented him from pursuing his own desires and dreams. He began to fantasize about escaping the suffocating grip she had on him. It was within this mindset that he began to entertain a disturbing idea. If he could eliminate her, he could finally live his life on his own terms, free from the constant burden of her expectations. The decision to murder his mother did not come overnight. It was a carefully calculated and chilling plan that Wu set in motion over the course of several months. He knew that killing her would not be an easy task, and he would need to cover his tracks if he hoped to get away with it. He meticulously planned every detail of the murder, from the location to the means by which he would carry it out. On July 10, 2015, Wu invited his mother to his residence in Fuzhou under the pretense of discussing his future plans. He told her that he wanted to share some important decisions about his life and education. Xie Tianqin, ever the concerned and dutiful mother, agreed to meet with him, believing it was simply another one of her son's moments of introspection. Little did she know that this meeting would mark the end of her life. Once Xie Tianqin arrived at Wu's residence, he lured her into a false sense of security by engaging her in a conversation about his future. He convinced her that the meeting was an opportunity for them to bond and talk about his plans after graduation. But Wu's mind was already made up. Without warning, he attacked his mother, striking her repeatedly with a dumbbell bar. The blunt force trauma caused fatal injuries, and Xie Tianqin's life was brutally cut short. After her death, Wu showed little emotion. His cold detachment was evident as he moved to conceal the body. He wrapped it in several layers of plastic and activated carbon to mask the odor of decomposition. Wu had planned for the body to remain hidden, and his next steps were part of a well-thought-out strategy to deceive others. He left the body in his dormitory, attempting to make it appear as if his mother had simply disappeared without a trace. As part of his elaborate plan, Wu crafted a story to explain his mother's sudden absence. He informed family members and close friends that Xie Tianqin had gone abroad with him to further his education. Wu claimed that his mother was staying in another country while he focused on his studies, a story that he would later use to defraud them out of large sums of money. The lie was convincing enough to keep his relatives at bay and prevent suspicion from arising. For several months, Wu continued to deceive everyone around him, including his extended family. He fabricated emails and phone calls, pretending to be his mother and assuring her relatives that she was safe and well. Meanwhile, he used the money he had taken from his mother's accounts to support his lavish lifestyle, buying high-end items and living without the constant oversight he had once endured. But the lies began to unravel. Xie Tianqin's relatives grew concerned when they hadn't heard from her in months. They began to suspect that something was amiss, and the police were soon involved. Investigations were launched into her disappearance, and eventually, the trail led to Wu Xiaoyu. His lies could no longer mask the truth. The cold-blooded murder of Xie Tianqin would soon be uncovered, and Wu's carefully constructed facade would come crashing down. The search for Xie Tianqin, and the subsequent investigation into her murder, would reveal the extent of Wu's deception. What had initially appeared to be a simple disappearance would soon evolve into one of the most shocking and chilling cases in recent memory. The public's reaction to the crime was one of disbelief and horror, as a promising young student was exposed as a cold-hearted killer, willing to go to unimaginable lengths to escape the grip of his overbearing mother. The truth about Wu Xiaoyu's dark and twisted motivations would come to light in the years that followed. But the crime he committed in 2015 would forever be etched in the memories of those who followed the case, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked resentment and the lengths to which a person can go when consumed by anger and fear. The investigation into Xie Tianqin's disappearance took a crucial turn when relatives started questioning the story Wu had concocted about her going abroad. Despite his attempts to maintain the lie, the absence of concrete evidence and the inconsistency in his explanations led them to grow increasingly suspicious. Wu had kept up the ruse by sending emails and making phone calls that were clearly not from his mother. In the days following her death, He had even used his mother's social media accounts to post fabricated updates, keeping her friends and family at bay. Xie Tianqin's extended family, feeling unsettled by the lack of contact and the strange behavior of Wu, decided to act. They contacted the police in February 2016 after repeated attempts to reach her failed. The authorities quickly took the matter seriously and began investigating the case as a possible missing person scenario. Wu, fearing that his secret was on the verge of being exposed, continued to lie and feign ignorance of his mother's whereabouts. The police, determined to find the truth, began to look into Wu's activities, starting with his financial transactions. It didn't take long for investigators to discover that Wu had been withdrawing large sums of money from his mother's bank accounts since her supposed departure. In addition, he had been living a life of luxury, far beyond what his modest student status would normally allow. The pattern of financial irregularities immediately raised red flags, and it was clear that something was terribly wrong. The investigation expanded to include interviews with Wu's friends and classmates. Many spoke of his unusual behavior in the months leading up to his mother's disappearance. Some noted that he had become increasingly distant, while others mentioned that he seemed to be acting unnervingly calm about the whole situation. This led detectives to focus more intently on Wu as their prime suspect. With the mounting evidence against him, the police finally decided to search Wu's residence. What they found inside would send shockwaves through the entire investigation. Beneath layers of carefully constructed lies, they uncovered the horrifying truth. Inside his dormitory, the authorities discovered the decomposed remains of Xie Tianqin, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and other materials designed to conceal the smell of death. It was a chilling sight, one that would forever change the course of the investigation and shock the entire nation. The forensic examination of the remains confirmed the cause of death, blunt force trauma consistent with the use of a heavy object, such as a dumbbell. The evidence was clear. Wu had brutally murdered his mother in a fit of rage, and then meticulously tried to cover it up, all while continuing to deceive everyone around him. His actions were cold and calculated, demonstrating a level of emotional detachment that made it even more difficult for those who knew him to believe. Wu's arrest came soon after the discovery of the body. He was taken into custody on April 20, 2019, when authorities managed to track him down to Chongqing Jiangbei International Airport. He had been attempting to flee the country, hoping to escape justice by traveling to a foreign destination. But his plan was thwarted. After his arrest, Wu was interrogated for hours, and eventually, he confessed to the murder, admitting that he had killed his mother out of frustration and resentment. The details Wu provided during his confession were chilling. He described how, after killing his mother with the dumbbell, he had taken careful measures to hide her body and deceive his family. He also confessed to forging documents, including email accounts and phone numbers, in order to maintain the illusion that his mother was still alive. He revealed that he had gone so far as to use her identity to withdraw money from her bank accounts and defraud her relatives of substantial amounts of money. The scale of his deceit was staggering, and it left many wondering how someone so seemingly intelligent and educated could carry out such a heinous crime without any regard for the consequences. Wu's motives for the murder, as he explained during his confession, were rooted in a long-standing resentment towards his mother. He felt that her constant pressure and high expectations had suffocated him, leaving him feeling trapped and unable to live life on his own terms. In his mind, killing her was the only way to break free from the suffocating grip she had on him. He believed that her death would allow him to take control of his own life, free from the constant judgment and demands of a mother who had pushed him too hard. In the months following his arrest, the case captured the attention of the media and the public. The fact that such a brutal crime had been committed by a highly educated young man, one who had attended a top university in China, left many questioning how someone so outwardly successful could commit such a horrific act. The case also sparked discussions about the pressures placed on children by their parents and the potential psychological consequences of these pressures. Experts in psychology and family dynamics weighed in on the case, pointing out the dangers of overbearing parenting and the toll it can take on a child's mental health. The trial, which began in 2020, was closely followed by the media. Wu Xieyu's defense team argued that he was mentally unstable at the time of the murder, attempting to present him as a person who had been driven to his breaking point by years of emotional turmoil. However, the prosecution painted a very different picture of Wu, a young man who, despite his outward appearance of being a model student, had harbored deep resentment and anger towards his mother. They argued that his actions were premeditated and cold-blooded, demonstrating a complete disregard for human life. The court proceedings were a tense and emotional experience for both the families involved and the public. Many were appalled by the depth of Wu's deception, and the case became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked familial tensions. Ultimately, Wu Xiyu was found guilty of murder and fraud. The court sentenced him to death for the brutal killing of his mother, and he was also ordered to serve 18 years in prison for the extensive fraud he had committed in the aftermath of her death. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and outrage. For some, the death sentence was a just punishment for the crime, while others believed that a life sentence would have been more appropriate, given Wu's young age and the potential for rehabilitation. Despite the divided opinions, the case was a turning point in the conversation about the pressures placed on children by their parents and the importance of fostering healthy family relationships. Wu's actions served as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences that can arise when unresolved emotional issues are left unchecked. As the case came to a close, Wu's story continued to haunt the public. His name became synonymous with the darkest side of familial relationships, and his crime remained a chilling example of how anger, resentment, and frustration can spiral out of control. The murder of Xie Tianqin not only destroyed a family, but also left an indelible mark on the society at large, prompting reflection on the complexities of family dynamics and the potential dangers of excessive expectations. As Wu Xiyu's trial came to an end, the public continued to grapple with the shocking nature of the crime. The story of a highly intelligent, educated young man committing such a brutal act against his own mother stunned many. The emotional and psychological toll of the case was immense for those who had known Wu and Xie Tianqin. People who had once viewed Wu as a promising student were left in disbelief, struggling to understand how someone with such potential could turn so cold and violent. The contrast between Wu's academic success and the horror of his crime was striking, leaving many to question the pressures placed on young individuals by their families and society. The trial itself had been intense, with both the prosecution and defense presenting compelling arguments. The prosecution argued that Wu's actions were premeditated, pointing to the careful planning and calculated deceit he had employed to cover up the murder. They emphasized that Wu's lack of remorse and his efforts to manipulate those around him showed a complete disregard for human life. In their eyes, this was not a crime of passion or a moment of temporary madness. It was the cold, deliberate murder of a mother at the hands of her own son. On the other hand, the defense tried to portray Wu as a young man who had been pushed to the brink by years of emotional turmoil and psychological distress. They suggested that the intense pressure he felt from his mother's high expectations had gradually eroded his mental health, leading to an emotional breakdown that resulted in the tragic murder. While the defense team acknowledged the gravity of the crime, they asked for leniency, urging the court to consider Wu's youth and potential for rehabilitation. They argued that the death penalty was too harsh a punishment for someone who was still in the early stages of adulthood. Despite the defense's plea for a reduced sentence, the court found Wu guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to death for the murder of his mother, and received an additional 18 years in prison for the fraud charges related to his deception and financial manipulation in the months following her death. The court's decision sent a strong message that no matter how high one's intellectual capabilities or academic achievements, no one is exempt from the consequences of their actions. While some supported the verdict, believing that justice had been served, others were torn. They questioned whether the severity of the punishment was truly appropriate for someone as young as Wu, who had made a grave mistake in the heat of a deeply psychological struggle. Yet, as the evidence presented during the trial suggested, Wu's actions were not impulsive. They were carefully planned, executed with chilling precision, and followed by a complex web of lies and deceit. His crime was not simply the result of a moment of emotional breakdown, but rather the outcome of a prolonged period of resentment and frustration. For Wu Xiyu, the weight of his crime would continue to haunt him for the rest of his life. After his conviction, he was transferred to a prison in Fujian province while awaiting the final decision on his appeal. The appeal process dragged on for several years, with Wu seeking to reduce his sentence or even have the death penalty overturned. He claimed that he was a victim of his own psychological state, and that he had not fully understood the consequences of his actions at the time of the murder. Despite his defense team's best efforts, the appeals court rejected his request for a reduced sentence. In May 2023, the Fujian Provincial High People's Court upheld the original death sentence, rejecting all of Wu's arguments and affirming that his actions were premeditated and carried out with full awareness of their consequences. The court's decision was final, and Wu was left with no legal recourse. His fate had been sealed, and his execution was set to take place in the near future. As the months passed, Wu's story became a subject of widespread discussion in China. The case was widely covered in the media, sparking debates about the pressures faced by students in the country's highly competitive educational system. Many experts weighed in on the psychological toll that these pressures can have on young people, particularly when coupled with the expectations of demanding parents. Wu's case was seen as a tragic example of the potential dangers that can arise from an overbearing and perfectionistic parenting style. Family dynamics and the impact of parental expectations became key topics in public discourse, with many calling for a shift in how children are raised and how parents approach their relationship with their children. Some argued that the intense academic competition in China, along with the pressure to succeed at all costs, was creating a generation of young people who felt immense emotional strain. In Wu's case, it was clear that his mother's relentless expectations had contributed to his psychological breakdown, leading him down a dark path of resentment and ultimately violence. The impact of Wu Xiu's crime was felt not only by his family, but also by the wider community. Xie Tianqin's relatives, who had placed their trust in Wu's fabricated story, were left devastated by the truth. They had been led to believe that she was alive and well, only to learn that she had been murdered by her own son. The grief and pain they felt were compounded by the realization that their trust in Wu had been completely betrayed. Xie Tianqin's murder also left a lasting impact on the public's perception of Wu. Once viewed as a promising student with a bright future, he became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked resentment and the potential consequences of emotional isolation. The fact that someone who appeared to have everything, intelligence, opportunity, and a good education, could commit such a horrific crime served as a wake-up call for many. It reminded society that even those who seem outwardly successful can be struggling with deep emotional turmoil, and that it is crucial to address mental health issues and family dynamics before they escalate into tragedy. Wu's story also highlighted the complexities of the Chinese legal system and the debate over the death penalty. While some advocated for his execution, others questioned whether the death sentence was the most effective way to deal with a young man who had committed such a crime in the context of emotional distress. The case prompted renewed discussions about the fairness and morality of capital punishment, particularly in cases involving individuals who were still young and had the potential for rehabilitation. In the end, Wu Xiu's execution by lethal injection on January 31st, 2024, closed a chapter on one of the most shocking and heartbreaking cases in recent memory. Despite his attempts to appeal, the court's decision remained final, and he paid the ultimate price for his actions. As the case faded from the headlines, it left behind an indelible legacy of cautionary lessons about the dangers of emotional neglect, the impact of parental pressure, and the importance of open communication within families. The murder of Xie Tianqin remained a tragic reminder of how unresolved psychological distress can spiral out of control, with devastating consequences for everyone involved. Story 6. In 2015, a chilling and tragic crime unfolded in the serene suburban neighborhood of Melbourne, Australia. The crime would later become one of the most talked about and heart-wrenching stories of the year. The perpetrator, who had once been an upstanding member of the community, was about to change everything when he unleashed a horrifying act of violence that would shake the entire city to its core. The man responsible for this heinous act was 38-year-old Christopher Michael Edwards. Born and raised in Melbourne, Edwards had always been described by those who knew him as a quiet, somewhat reclusive individual. He had worked as a truck driver for several years, living a relatively simple and uneventful life. To the outside world, Edwards seemed like a man who kept to himself and avoided drawing attention. He had a few close friends, and his personal life was largely a mystery to many, but there was nothing that suggested he was capable of such a violent act. However, behind the closed doors of his home, Edwards was struggling with a deeply troubled mind. His marriage to his wife, 33-year-old Tara, had been fraught with tension for years. While they had initially met through mutual friends and seemed to have a good connection, their relationship quickly soured. Tara, a mother of 2 young children, found herself overwhelmed by the pressures of daily life. Christopher, on the other hand, had become increasingly difficult to live with, his emotional and mental state deteriorating over time. The couple's marriage had been filled with arguments and financial strain, and their relationship was on the brink of collapse. Tara had confided in friends and family that she felt trapped in a marriage where she no longer felt safe or loved. She had tried to reach out for help, but Christopher's controlling behavior made it difficult for her to break free. Despite her best efforts to leave him, Tara found herself constantly drawn back into the toxic dynamic of their relationship. Edwards had become possessive and paranoid, accusing her of infidelity and accusing her of plotting to leave him. On the night of November 26, 2015, a tragedy occurred that would shatter the lives of everyone involved. Christopher Edwards, seemingly unable to cope with the mounting pressures in his personal life, snapped. In a fit of rage, he brutally attacked his wife Tara inside their home. The details of what exactly transpired that night remain unclear, but what is known is that Tara Edwards met a horrific and violent end. Christopher, in an uncontrollable burst of anger, struck her multiple times with a blunt object before strangling her to death. After killing his wife, Edwards took the body and disposed of it in a nearby creek, attempting to hide his crime. He thought that by getting rid of Tara's remains, he could cover his tracks and avoid detection. But in his panic and desperation to evade capture, Edwards made several mistakes. He called a few friends to tell them about an argument he had with his wife earlier in the evening, and one of these friends later became suspicious when they hadn't heard from Tara for days. Edwards continued to try to cover his tracks, feigning concern for his missing wife and pretending to be a distraught husband. He went about his daily life as if nothing had happened, trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He spoke to neighbors, even went to work, all while concealing the gruesome reality of what he had done. The investigation into Tara's disappearance began a few days after she was last seen. Police were initially perplexed, as there was little evidence to suggest any foul play. Christopher, however, continued to paint a picture of an ordinary, troubled marriage, which added to the confusion. Tara's friends and family began to grow increasingly worried as the days passed without any sign of her. They knew something was wrong and refused to believe that she had simply run away, especially with 2 young children at home. As the investigation progressed, a few key pieces of evidence started to emerge, casting doubt on Edwards' version of events. One of the first breakthroughs came when Tara's friends contacted police to report that they had heard from Edwards in the days after her disappearance. They had noticed that he seemed unusually calm, almost detached, when discussing Tara's absence. His behavior, they said, was inconsistent with someone who had just lost their spouse. Detectives also began to scrutinize Edwards' phone records and found something telling. He had made several calls to his wife's phone after she had been killed, even though she was no longer alive to answer. This inconsistency raised suspicions, prompting authorities to take a closer look at his movements and behavior leading up to and following Tara's disappearance. Upon further investigation, it was revealed that Edwards had been involved in several financial transactions that suggested he was trying to cover his tracks and create an alibi. Despite the mounting evidence, Edwards initially continued to deny any involvement in his wife's death. However, as police gathered more and more information, the walls began to close in on him. Investigators uncovered key pieces of forensic evidence that linked him directly to the crime scene. There were traces of Tara's blood found in the house, as well as forensic evidence that indicated she had been assaulted before her death. Finally, the truth began to emerge. Christopher Edwards was arrested on charges of murder, and the full extent of his crime was revealed. In a statement to the police, he admitted to killing his wife in a fit of rage, claiming that he had been consumed with jealousy and anger after an argument over their failing marriage. He said that he had lost control and acted out of a deep sense of betrayal. The murder of Tara Edwards was a devastating tragedy that left her family, friends, and community reeling. She was a mother, daughter, and friend, someone who had been loved by many. Her brutal death left a permanent scar on the lives of those who knew her. In the weeks following her murder, tributes poured in from all corners of Melbourne, as people expressed their grief over the loss of a vibrant woman whose life was taken far too soon. Christopher Edwards' arrest sent shockwaves through the community, as many had believed he was simply a man struggling with the pressures of family life. His crime, however, exposed a dark side of a man who had allowed anger and jealousy to consume him, ultimately leading him to commit an unforgivable act. What was once a seemingly normal suburban family was torn apart by a senseless act of violence, leaving behind a wake of pain, loss, and unanswered questions. The case garnered widespread media attention, sparking conversations about domestic violence, mental health, and the often hidden struggles that occur behind closed doors. Christopher Edwards' actions became a grim reminder of the devastating consequences that can result from unchecked anger and emotional abuse. The crime highlighted the importance of understanding the signs of domestic violence and supporting individuals who may be struggling within toxic relationships. As the trial began, the court would soon learn that Christopher Edwards had been hiding behind the facade of a loving husband and father for years. The emotional damage caused by his actions would have lasting effects on his children, his family, and the entire community. The story of Tara Edwards and the tragic end to her life would resonate with many, as it raised questions about the hidden dangers lurking in seemingly ordinary relationships and the devastating consequences of domestic violence. The investigation into Tara Edwards' disappearance continued to unfold with chilling clarity as detectives began to piece together more details of the crime. Christopher Edwards' behavior after Tara's murder raised significant suspicions. His calm demeanor in the days following her disappearance, as well as his odd detachment when discussing his wife's absence, was starkly inconsistent with someone who had just lost their spouse. Police quickly became suspicious of Edwards' actions and began to dig deeper into his life. One of the first significant leads came from interviews with the Edwards' close friends and family. Several people noted how Edwards had acted strangely in the days following Tara's disappearance. He had been unusually composed, almost eerily indifferent, when asked about his wife. He had told a neighbor that Tara had simply left him, though this explanation didn't sit well with those who knew her. Tara was a dedicated mother who would never leave her children behind, especially without any word or explanation. As the investigation continued, police began to gather evidence that contradicted Edwards' claims. Through forensic analysis, investigators were able to trace traces of Tara's blood throughout their house. Bloodstains were found on the floor, leading investigators to believe that she had been violently attacked in the home before her death. The presence of blood and other physical evidence indicated that she had not simply disappeared, as Edwards had suggested, but had been the victim of a brutal crime. This was a major breakthrough in the case, but there was still no clear motive, yet. As police examined Edwards' phone records, a critical discovery was made. It was revealed that after his wife's death, Edwards had made several phone calls to Tara's number. The calls were all made at odd hours, and police quickly realized that Edwards was attempting to maintain the illusion that Tara was still alive and that they were trying to reach her. The calls were a clear sign that Edwards was trying to cover his tracks, making the lie that she had left him seem more plausible to the outside world. When police began to delve deeper into his financial activities, more signs of foul play emerged. Edwards had been trying to cover his tracks financially, making a series of transactions that were both strange and concerning. He had withdrawn large sums of money and had used Tara's bank cards in ways that suggested he was trying to hide evidence and create an alibi. These financial actions were further proof that Edwards was far from the distraught husband he claimed to be. Through these investigations, it became increasingly clear that Christopher Edwards had been lying. There was no evidence to suggest that Tara had simply left him, as he had so often claimed. Instead, the truth began to surface. Edwards had murdered his wife in a fit of rage and had disposed of her body in an attempt to hide the evidence. His attempts to maintain normalcy in the days following her death had only served to raise more suspicions, and detectives were now focused on gathering the evidence needed to bring him to justice. Finally, the breakthrough came when investigators received a tip from one of Edwards' friends. This individual came forward with crucial information. They had recalled that Christopher had been unusually calm and composed when discussing his wife's disappearance. In one conversation, Edwards had even gone so far as to say that Tara had simply left him. This statement contradicted everything they knew about Tara's character and set off alarm bells for investigators. The tip led police to revisit the scene where Tara's body was found, a creek located just outside Melbourne. The area had initially seemed like an unlikely place to find a body, but new forensic evidence uncovered by the team painted a different picture. They found traces of Tara's blood and clothing, which matched her own. The remains, though decomposed, were confirmed to be hers. Tara had been dumped there by Christopher Edwards in a desperate attempt to dispose of the body and erase any trace of his crime. It was a cold, calculated move to hide the evidence and avoid detection. With the discovery of Tara's body, the case moved into the final stages of investigation. Edwards was brought in for questioning, where he initially denied any involvement in his wife's death. He stuck to his story, insisting that she had left him, though his inconsistencies were becoming harder to ignore. Eventually, after hours of intense questioning, Christopher Edwards finally broke down and confessed to the crime. In a chilling and emotionless confession, Edwards explained how he had killed Tara after a heated argument. He admitted to attacking her with a blunt object before strangling her to death in a fit of jealousy and anger. He spoke about his deep resentment toward her and how he had felt betrayed by her refusal to comply with his demands and expectations. Edwards revealed that he had planned the murder in advance, taking steps to cover his tracks and hide the evidence of his crime. Edwards explained that he had disposed of Tara's body in the creek in an attempt to make it appear as if she had simply disappeared. He had hoped that by hiding the body and pretending to be a grieving husband, he could avoid suspicion and buy himself time. He had even called his friends and family, pretending to be concerned about his wife's whereabouts, while secretly knowing exactly what had happened to her. The confession shocked those who had known Edwards, as they could not reconcile the man they had known with the brutal murderer he had become. It was difficult for anyone to understand how someone who had appeared so normal and quiet could be capable of such a horrific crime. The more investigators learned about Edwards' troubled relationship with his wife, the clearer it became that his anger and controlling behavior had been the driving forces behind the murder. The details of the crime were heart-wrenching. Tara Edwards had been the victim of years of emotional and psychological abuse, and her tragic end was a consequence of Christopher's inability to control his jealousy, rage, and insecurity. He had failed to seek help for his issues and had allowed his emotions to control him, ultimately leading to the brutal murder of his wife. Tara, on the other hand, had been a mother and a friend, someone who had struggled to break free from the suffocating grip of her abusive relationship. As the investigation drew to a close and Edwards was arrested and charged with his wife's murder, the community was left in shock. The crime had come out of nowhere, with no warning signs to alert those around Tara to the danger she was in. Edwards' ability to hide his true nature and maintain a facade of normalcy for so long left many wondering how such a tragedy could have been prevented. For Tara's family, the loss was incomprehensible. She had been a loving daughter, a devoted mother, and a caring friend. Her brutal death left an indelible mark on everyone who knew her, and her memory would live on in the hearts of those she left behind. For her children, the loss of their mother would be something they would struggle with for the rest of their lives. The case highlighted the dangers of emotional abuse, control, and unchecked anger. It also raised awareness about the prevalence of domestic violence and the often hidden dangers in relationships that appear normal on the surface. Christopher Edwards' actions had forever altered the lives of those involved, and his conviction would serve as a reminder of the tragic consequences of unchecked rage and emotional abuse. Edwards' trial would soon follow, and as the legal process unfolded, it became clear that this was a case that would not be easily forgotten. Christopher Edwards' trial began with a sense of anticipation and unease, as the community and the public waited for the full details of the crime to be laid out in court. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense as Tara's family, friends, and members of the community gathered to witness the proceedings. Edwards, once a man they had known as a quiet and seemingly ordinary person, now stood accused of taking the life of his wife in a brutal and calculated manner. The prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing the sequence of events that led to Tara's death. They highlighted the chilling facts uncovered during the investigation: how Edwards had carefully plotted the murder, how he had concealed his actions, and how he had attempted to manipulate those around him with false stories and fake concern. The evidence was damning. The bloodstains found throughout the house, the phone calls made to his wife's number after her death, and the financial transactions that suggested Edwards was trying to cover his tracks. All of these details painted a clear picture of a man who had committed an unforgivable act of violence. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Edwards had been a man under extreme emotional distress. They suggested that his mental state at the time of the murder had been severely impacted by years of marital strain and psychological turmoil. They portrayed him as a man who had snapped in a moment of uncontrollable rage, unable to process the overwhelming emotions that had been building up for months. They sought to minimize his actions by emphasizing his apparent remorse after the crime and his eventual confession to the authorities. Throughout the trial, Edwards sat quietly in the courtroom, his face often unreadable. He seemed detached from the proceedings, offering little in terms of emotion or reaction. Some witnesses described him as appearing almost cold, with his eyes occasionally cast downward, as though lost in his own thoughts. This lack of visible emotion only added to the eerie nature of the case, making it difficult for many to fully grasp the horror of what he had done. As the trial progressed, Tara's family took the stand to testify about the woman they had lost. Her mother, father, and close friends spoke about Tara's kind heart, her dedication to her children, and the love she had shown to those around her. They shared memories of the vibrant woman she had been, someone who had fought tirelessly to provide for her family, even in the face of adversity. Their testimonies were a stark contrast to the cold reality of the man responsible for her death. Tara's mother, in particular, was visibly shaken as she recalled her last moments with her daughter. She spoke of how Tara had confided in her about the difficulties in her marriage, how she had tried to leave Edwards multiple times, but had always been drawn back by his manipulative behavior. Tara's mother described how she had tried to support her daughter, offering words of encouragement and love, but Tara had felt trapped in a relationship that had grown increasingly toxic. Her mother's words were a painful reminder of the emotional and psychological abuse Tara had endured before her death. Tara's children, though too young to fully comprehend the tragedy, were left with the burden of losing their mother in such a violent and senseless manner. The court had no access to their testimony, but their presence in the hearts of everyone involved in the case was undeniable. They had been left without the love and guidance of their mother, a loss that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The tragedy of Tara's death had a ripple effect that would continue to reverberate through the years, affecting not only her family, but also the community as a whole. In contrast, Edward's family and friends were left in disbelief. Many of them could not reconcile the man they had known with the monster who had committed such an atrocity. Some expressed shock, others confusion, and some even claimed they had never seen any signs of the violent tendencies that were now being revealed in court. The question lingered in the minds of many. How could someone who had seemed so normal and unassuming be capable of such a brutal act? The prosecution argued that Edward's actions were the result of deep-seated anger and jealousy, exacerbated by years of controlling and abusive behavior toward Tara. They painted a picture of a man who had become consumed by his need for control and his sense of entitlement, believing that he could not bear the thought of his wife leaving him. The evidence showed that Edwards had been unable to cope with the idea of losing his partner, and in a moment of anger, he had taken the most extreme and irreversible step. As the trial neared its conclusion, the court had to decide whether Edwards would be held fully accountable for his crime. The prosecution pushed for a conviction of murder, emphasizing the cold and calculated nature of the crime. They argued that Edwards' actions were premeditated, and that his attempts to cover up the crime after the fact demonstrated a deliberate effort to avoid detection. His lack of genuine remorse or emotion during the trial only further solidified the prosecution's argument that this was a crime of malice, not an impulsive act of passion. The defense, while acknowledging Edwards' responsibility for his actions, sought to argue that his emotional state at the time of the murder was a mitigating factor. They requested a verdict of manslaughter instead of murder, suggesting that Edwards had not fully understood the consequences of his actions in his emotionally compromised state. They pointed to his eventual confession as evidence of his remorse and argued that his mental state had played a significant role in the tragic events that had unfolded. After several weeks of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict. Christopher Edwards was found guilty of the murder of his wife, Tara Edwards. The court had determined that he had, indeed, premeditated the crime, acting out of anger and jealousy, with no regard for the life he had taken. Tara's family breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow in the face of the immense loss they had endured. In the weeks following the verdict, Edwards was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge expressed his deep regret for the devastating loss of Tara's life and the impact her death had on her family. He spoke of the brutality of the crime and the need for accountability, sending a clear message that domestic violence and murder would not be tolerated. For Tara's family, the pain of her loss remained. They had fought for justice, and in the end, they had seen Edwards held accountable for his actions. But the hole left in their lives by her absence would never be filled. Her children, who were now without their mother, were left to navigate a world without the love and care she had provided. The story of Tara Edwards was a tragic reminder of the dangers of domestic abuse, the horrors that can lie behind closed doors, and the devastating consequences of unchecked anger and violence. Story 7. In 2015, Europe was rocked by a series of high-profile criminal events that not only shocked the public, but also prompted significant changes in security policies and international cooperation. One of the most devastating incidents was the series of terrorist attacks in Paris on November 13, 2015. Coordinated by the Islamic State, ISIS, these attacks targeted multiple locations across the city, including the Bataclan Concert Hall, the Stade de France Stadium, and several cafes and restaurants. The assailants, heavily armed and determined, carried out their attacks with chilling precision, resulting in 130 fatalities and hundreds of injuries. This tragedy marked one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in Europe in recent history and sent shockwaves throughout the continent. The Paris attacks were meticulously planned, with the perpetrators traveling across Europe to execute their mission. The attackers were well armed, carrying automatic weapons and explosives, and they executed their plan with a level of coordination that indicated extensive preparation. The assault on the Bataclan Concert Hall, where a rock band was performing, was particularly harrowing. Hostages were taken, and the attackers opened fire indiscriminately, leading to a high number of casualties. The siege ended when French police stormed the venue, but not before the attackers had caused immense devastation. In the aftermath of the attacks, French authorities launched an extensive investigation, uncovering a network of individuals linked to the assailants. The investigation revealed that the attackers had connections to ISIS operatives in Syria and had received training and support from the terrorist organization. The attacks were a stark reminder of the persistent threat of terrorism in Europe and highlighted the need for enhanced intelligence, sharing and counterterrorism measures among European nations. The Paris attacks had a profound impact on Europe, leading to increased security measures and a re-evaluation of counterterrorism strategies. The European Union and individual countries implemented stricter border controls, enhanced surveillance, and increased cooperation among intelligence agencies. The attacks also sparked debates about the balance between security and civil liberties, with discussions focusing on how to effectively combat terrorism without infringing on individual rights. In addition to the Paris attacks, 2015 also saw the thwarting of a major terrorist plot on a Valais high-speed train traveling from Amsterdam to Paris. On August 21, 2015, a heavily armed assailant, later identified as Ayub Kazani, boarded the train in Brussels with the intent to carry out a mass shooting. However, his plans were foiled by the quick actions of passengers, including 3 Americans, Spencer Stone, Alex Scarlatos, and Anthony Sadler, who subdued Kazani before he could execute his attack. The incident underscored the ongoing threat of terrorism in Europe and the importance of public vigilance and preparedness in the face of such threats. Kazani, a Moroccan national, was arrested and later charged with attempted murder and terrorism-related offenses. Investigations revealed that he had been planning the attack for several months and had acquired weapons, including an assault rifle and a Luger pistol, which he intended to use to kill passengers. His arrest and the subsequent trial highlighted the persistent threat of lone wolf attacks and the challenges law enforcement agencies face in preventing such incidents. The Valais train attack also prompted discussions about the security measures in place on European trains and the need for enhanced screening and surveillance to prevent similar attacks in the future. The bravery of the passengers who intervened was widely praised, and the incident served as a reminder of the potential dangers faced by public transportation systems and the importance of preparedness and quick response in mitigating such threats. Beyond terrorism, 2015 also witnessed significant developments in organized crime across Europe. The Netherlands, known for its liberal drug policies, faced a surge in drug-related violence and organized crime. The rise of powerful drug cartels and the increasing use of violence to control drug trafficking routes led to a series of high-profile murders and shootings. The situation escalated to the point where the Dutch government had to deploy additional law enforcement resources to combat the growing threat. Organized crime syndicates in the Netherlands were involved in various illicit activities, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and extortion. The competition among these groups for control over drug markets and trafficking routes led to violent confrontations and a significant increase in criminal activities. The Dutch authorities responded by implementing stricter laws and regulations, enhancing police presence in affected areas, and increasing international cooperation to dismantle these criminal networks. The rise of organized crime in the Netherlands also had broader implications for European security. The activities of these criminal groups often crossed national borders, affecting neighboring countries and requiring coordinated efforts to address the issue. The situation highlighted the need for a unified approach to combating organized crime in Europe, involving law enforcement agencies, policymakers, and international organizations working together to tackle the root causes and manifestations of such criminal activities. In the United Kingdom, 2015 was marked by the conviction of several individuals involved in large-scale drug trafficking operations. The National Crime Agency, NCA, reported a significant increase in the number of drug-related arrests and convictions, reflecting the growing challenge of combating drug-related crime in the country. The NCA's efforts were part of a broader strategy to disrupt and dismantle organized crime groups operating within the UK. The convictions were the result of extensive investigations and operations carried out by the NCA in collaboration with local police forces and international partners. These operations targeted key figures within drug trafficking organizations and aimed to disrupt the supply chains of illegal drugs entering the UK. The successful convictions were seen as a significant step in the fight against organized crime and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated law enforcement efforts. The rise in drug-related crime in the UK also prompted discussions about the effectiveness of current drug policies and the need for comprehensive strategies to address the root causes of drug abuse and trafficking. There was a growing recognition that a multifaceted approach involving prevention, treatment, and enforcement was necessary to effectively combat the complex issue of drug-related crime. In Italy, 2015 saw the conviction of several individuals involved in the infamous 'Ndrangheta crime syndicate, one of the most powerful and secretive criminal organizations in Europe. The convictions were the result of a lengthy investigation that uncovered the syndicate's extensive involvement in drug trafficking, extortion, and money laundering. The trial was hailed as a significant victory in the fight against organized crime in Italy. The 'Ndrangheta's operations were not limited to Italy. The organization had established a strong presence in several European countries, including Germany and the Netherlands, and was involved in various illicit activities across the continent. The convictions in 2015 were seen as a major blow to the syndicate's operations and a testament to the effectiveness of international cooperation in combating organized crime. The Italian government's efforts to combat the 'Ndrangheta were part of a broader strategy to address organized crime in the country, which included strengthening law enforcement agencies, enhancing legal frameworks, and increasing public awareness of the dangers posed by such criminal organizations. The convictions in 2015 were a significant step forward in this ongoing battle. These events in 2015 highlight the diverse and evolving nature of criminal activities in Europe, ranging from terrorist attacks to organized crime syndicates. They underscore the need for robust security measures, international cooperation, and public vigilance to effectively combat and prevent such crimes. The lessons learned from these incidents have shaped policies and strategies in Europe, aiming to create a safer environment for all citizens. The year 2015 continued to test Europe's resolve in the face of increasing security threats. In the aftermath of the Paris attacks, the European Union began to take bold steps toward addressing the growing dangers of terrorism and transnational crime. Counterterrorism agencies across Europe ramped up efforts to detect and thwart potential attacks, leading to a series of operations that targeted individuals and networks linked to extremist groups like ISIS. As part of a broader strategy, European law enforcement agencies coordinated with intelligence services from the United States, Middle Eastern countries, and other international allies. The goal was to dismantle terrorist cells operating across the continent and prevent future attacks. Within a month of the Paris attacks, authorities in Brussels uncovered a vast network that connected ISIS operatives in Belgium, France, and Syria. The discovery of this network highlighted the persistent threat of foreign fighters and the complexities of countering terrorism that operated on such an international scale. In Belgium, the aftermath of the attacks led to a series of high-profile raids and arrests, particularly in the Molenbeek district of Brussels, which had become notorious for being a hotbed of radicalization. The Belgian authorities were under intense pressure to address the issue of extremism within their borders, and the events following the Paris attacks marked a turning point in how the country approached domestic terrorism. Molenbeek was home to several of the individuals involved in the Paris attacks, including the Abdeslam brothers, who played a significant role in the planning and execution of the strikes. Salah Abdeslam, one of the last surviving members of the terrorist cell, was eventually captured in March 2016 in the same district, an arrest that was widely considered a major breakthrough in the fight against ISIS-linked terrorism. While Belgium faced intense scrutiny over its inability to prevent the attacks, the wider European response to the crisis became increasingly focused on countering extremist ideology, increasing surveillance, and improving intelligence sharing among EU member states. In the wake of the attacks, governments across the continent pushed for stronger measures to identify and track potential jihadist sympathizers, leading to the implementation of stricter border controls and intelligence protocols. The fear that ISIS or other terror groups could exploit Europe's open borders to move freely across the continent further fueled these initiatives. In the realm of organized crime, 2015 saw a surge in violence, particularly in regions where powerful drug cartels and criminal syndicates operated. The European drug market had grown increasingly complex, with criminal organizations leveraging globalization and the rise of international shipping routes to smuggle vast quantities of illicit substances across borders. Major hubs in Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium had long been targets for drug trade routes, and by 2015, the violence between competing drug cartels and law enforcement had escalated. In Spain, the country faced an influx of drugs from Latin America, particularly cocaine and heroin. The Spanish police launched Operation Tarzan, which targeted a notorious Colombian drug cartel known for smuggling large amounts of cocaine through the Spanish ports. This operation, which had been under surveillance for several years, culminated in the arrest of dozens of individuals linked to the cartel. The cartel's influence extended beyond Spain, with several operatives and drug kingpins operating in other parts of Europe, including the UK and the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the port of Rotterdam had long been a central hub for drug trafficking, serving as a major entry point for drugs destined for other European markets. The Dutch government was facing an alarming surge in drug-related crime, with organized criminal groups using the ports to smuggle drugs hidden in containers of legitimate goods. This led to an increase in cartel-related violence, with rival groups waging bloody turf wars over control of distribution networks. In response, the Dutch police expanded their anti-drug operations, which included the use of state-of-the-art technology to track and monitor shipments in real time. One of the most notable developments in 2015 was the conviction of the leaders of the notorious Mafia del Tartufo, Mafia of Truffles, in Italy. While it may sound unusual, this criminal organization, which operated in northern Italy, was responsible for the trafficking and black market sales of highly prized truffles. These rare fungi, highly sought after by the global fine dining industry, were harvested and sold illegally by the group, leading to significant economic losses for legitimate truffle producers. Their activities also included extortion, smuggling, and money laundering, all of which contributed to their rapid rise in criminal prominence. The authorities cracked down on the group in a high-profile raid that resulted in the arrest of several key members. However, it wasn't just drug trafficking or illicit goods that plagued Europe. One of the most shocking incidents of organized crime in 2015 came in the form of a widespread human trafficking operation that spanned several European countries. The operation, which had its roots in Eastern Europe, involved the smuggling of thousands of men, women, and children into the European Union, where they were exploited for labor, forced prostitution, and other forms of abuse. The victims were often transported through the Balkans, with traffickers using false documentation and covert routes to evade law enforcement. The international nature of this operation made it incredibly difficult to combat, but European authorities gradually began to piece together the network. The human trafficking crisis took on new urgency in the wake of the 2015 refugee crisis, where millions of migrants fleeing war-torn countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq sought asylum in Europe. Traffickers often preyed on the vulnerable refugees, offering them false promises of safe passage and employment in European countries, only to exploit them once they arrived. The discovery of the extent of these trafficking rings prompted a large-scale collaborative response from European law enforcement, which focused on dismantling the organizations behind the illegal smuggling networks. The European Union, along with agencies such as Europol and Interpol, sought to disrupt the flow of human trafficking through targeted operations and strengthened border controls. The refugee crisis and the escalating levels of organized crime were not isolated issues, but were often intertwined. Traffickers took advantage of the chaos and the desperation of migrants seeking a better life, further complicating the efforts to protect vulnerable individuals and crack down on the criminal networks operating within the EU. In the wake of these events, the European Union made a commitment to increase cooperation with international partners, including those in the Middle East and Africa, to better manage migration and prevent exploitation. Despite the overwhelming challenges faced by European law enforcement in 2015, there were notable successes. The conviction of key members of the Mafia del Tartufo and the arrests made during drug busts were a testament to the determination of European authorities to combat organized crime and its impact on society. The battle against terrorism and organized crime was a difficult and ongoing one, but in 2015, it had become clear that the efforts to unite across borders, strengthen cooperation, and improve surveillance were beginning to yield results. The challenges faced by European countries in 2015 were not just limited to terrorism and organized crime. The year also saw a significant rise in political and social tensions, further complicating the landscape of criminal activity. As the refugee crisis reached its peak, the European Union struggled to balance its humanitarian obligations with the need to ensure security. Countries like Hungary, Germany, and Greece became focal points for migration, with tens of thousands of refugees arriving daily, fleeing war, poverty, and persecution from countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. While many Europeans were sympathetic to the plight of these refugees, there was a growing backlash from right-wing groups who viewed the influx of migrants as a threat to national security and cultural identity. This divide led to an increase in anti-immigrant sentiments, protests, and, in some cases, violent clashes. Far-right extremist groups, many of whom had links to organized crime syndicates, exploited this division, fueling social unrest and creating an environment ripe for criminal activity. These groups used the chaos surrounding the refugee crisis as a recruiting tool, targeting disillusioned individuals to join their cause and spread their message of hate. In response to the increasing volatility, governments across Europe took steps to tighten border controls and restrict the flow of migrants, but these measures were not without their own consequences. While some countries, like Germany, maintained relatively open borders, others, such as Hungary, built fences and imposed strict entry requirements, effectively turning away refugees who were seeking safety and a better future. This divide between Eastern and Western European countries created further tensions within the EU, and the situation reached a boiling point in 2015. At the same time, the European Union's response to organized crime became more unified, with increased emphasis on cooperation among law enforcement agencies, intelligence sharing, and the implementation of advanced technological tools to track criminal networks. One of the most significant efforts in this area was the establishment of the European Counterterrorism Center, ECTC, which aimed to streamline the coordination between member states to combat terrorism and transnational crime. The ECTC was responsible for overseeing joint operations, gathering intelligence, and ensuring that European countries could respond quickly to emerging threats. But while there was progress in countering terrorism and organized crime, the situation in Europe was far from stable. The attacks in Paris, the foiled train assault in Belgium, and the persistent threats of ISIS and other extremist groups continued to loom large. Each new attack or thwarted plot was a reminder that Europe was still very much in the crosshairs of international terror organizations. Beyond the headlines, 2015 also marked a significant shift in the way Europe approached cybercrime. As digital technologies continued to evolve, so too did the tactics used by criminals. Cyber attacks and data breaches became more frequent and more sophisticated, targeting everything from government institutions to multinational corporations and individuals. The dark web, a hidden part of the internet that allows for anonymous transactions, became a marketplace for illegal goods and services, including weapons, drugs, and even human trafficking. European law enforcement agencies, including Europol, began to focus more resources on tracking down cybercriminals and disrupting these networks, but the global nature of cybercrime made it a difficult battle to win. In addition to traditional criminal activity, European authorities were also grappling with the rise of financial crime in 2015. The increasing sophistication of money laundering techniques, combined with the continued growth of online financial services, created new challenges for regulators and law enforcement agencies. Criminal organizations were using increasingly complex methods to launder illicit funds, often hiding the origins of their money through shell companies, fake charities, and other fraudulent schemes. The infamous Panama Papers leak in 2015 exposed the extent to which wealthy individuals and corporations were using offshore tax havens to hide billions of dollars in assets, often circumventing tax laws and regulations in their home countries. This financial crime, often linked to organized crime syndicates, further undermined the integrity of European economies. Governments were forced to respond with stricter financial regulations and increased surveillance of financial transactions. The European Union introduced new anti-money laundering directives aimed at increasing transparency in financial systems and tightening controls on international financial transactions. These measures were aimed at disrupting the flow of illicit funds and ensuring that criminals could no longer hide behind the complex structures of the global financial system. One of the most shocking revelations of 2015 came from the United Kingdom, where a series of high-profile money laundering schemes were exposed, implicating prominent banks and financial institutions. These revelations sparked a public outcry, with citizens demanding greater accountability from their governments and financial institutions. Investigations into the so-called Panama Papers scandal revealed that several banks and law firms were complicit in facilitating tax evasion and money laundering for some of the world's wealthiest individuals and corporations. In the midst of these challenges, law enforcement agencies across Europe also had to contend with the rise of cyber-terrorism. Hackers aligned with terrorist organizations were using the internet to recruit, radicalize, and communicate, making it difficult for authorities to track their activities. In some instances, terrorists used social media platforms to incite violence, spreading propaganda and encouraging lone wolf attacks. These new forms of cyber-terrorism added another layer of complexity to an already tense and volatile security landscape. Yet, even amid the chaos, there were moments of triumph. In 2015, European authorities were able to make significant arrests and dismantle several major criminal organizations. The arrest of Salah Abdeslam, the key suspect in the Paris attacks, was a major victory in the global fight against terrorism. Similarly, European Union cooperation led to the conviction of several notorious drug lords and members of organized crime syndicates operating in multiple countries. These victories served as reminders that while the challenges of 2015 were significant, the resolve of European law enforcement to confront these issues was equally strong. By the end of 2015, the landscape of European crime had been forever altered. Terrorism, organized crime, financial crime, and cyber threats had become deeply intertwined, with each issue feeding into the other. The year had highlighted the need for continued vigilance, cooperation, and adaptation in the face of an ever-evolving threat landscape. As Europe moved into 2016, the lessons learned in 2015 would continue to shape the continent's approach to security, crime prevention, and international cooperation. The challenge was far from over, but Europe had shown that, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, it would stand united in its fight for safety and justice. Story 8. In 2015, the United States was grappling with a number of high-profile criminal cases, some of which would shape the way law enforcement handled major investigations in the years to come. One such case that captivated the nation was the murder of a prominent New York businessman, Robert McKeon. McKeon, a well-known real estate mogul with ties to several influential figures in the city, was found dead in his penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side. The investigation into his death would become one of the most complicated and controversial cases of the year, with numerous twists, turns, and a cast of potential suspects who ranged from business associates to family members. Robert McKeon had built a successful empire in New York City's competitive real estate market. He was a figure of power and influence, often attending charity galas, hosting extravagant parties, and frequently spotted in the company of politicians and high-ranking business people. His wealth was not only derived from real estate deals, but also from investments in tech startups and international ventures. His life seemed perfect on the surface, yet McKeon had a reputation for being ruthless in business, often using underhanded tactics to get ahead. His rivals knew him as a man who would stop at nothing to secure his position in the industry. The night of McKeon's death was eerily quiet. His assistant, who usually checked in on him every evening, had noticed that Robert had not answered her calls. Concerned, she made her way to his apartment, using her key to gain access. Inside, she found McKeon lying face down in a pool of blood. His apartment, a lavish space filled with expensive artwork and furniture, was in disarray. The crime scene appeared as if there had been a struggle, An initial report suggested that McKeon had been shot at close range, possibly by someone he knew. The scene gave investigators the distinct impression that this was not a random act of violence. The immediate suspicion fell on those closest to McKeon, his family and business associates. His wife, Veronica McKeon, was the first to be questioned. The couple's marriage had been tumultuous, marked by public disputes and allegations of infidelity on both sides. Veronica, a former fashion model, had a well-documented history of extramarital affairs, and her relationship with Robert had soured in recent years. Despite this, the couple maintained an image of a happy, wealthy family in the eyes of the public. Veronica, who was in her mid-40s, was initially cooperative with police, but her nervous demeanor and inconsistent statements led investigators to believe she might be hiding something. She was quickly placed under surveillance while detectives examined her financial records and any possible motives for murder. At the same time, investigators began to focus on Robert's business dealings. McKeon had made several enemies over the years, particularly among rival real estate developers and investors. One of the key figures under investigation was Mark Graves, a former business partner of McKeon's who had been recently ousted from a joint venture. Graves was known for his volatile temperament, and it was rumored that the fallout from their partnership had been particularly bitter. He had publicly accused McKeon of dishonesty and taking credit for projects they had worked on together. A few months before McKeon's death, Graves had threatened to expose Robert's alleged illegal activities, including bribery and money laundering. This led investigators to wonder if Graves had a personal vendetta against McKeon and whether that could have motivated him to take drastic measures. Another suspect that emerged was Lisa Turner, a young woman who had been working as Robert McKeon's personal assistant. Turner, a college graduate with a bright future, had been employed by McKeon for several years, during which time she had grown close to him. Sources close to the couple suggested that Turner had developed an emotional attachment to Robert, and there were whispers about an affair between the two. However, Turner adamantly denied any romantic involvement with her boss. She claimed to have been at home the night of the murder and had no idea who would want to harm McKeon. Her alibi, however, was difficult to verify, and investigators began to suspect that she might have been more involved in McKeon's life and death than she was letting on. The investigation took a surprising turn when it was revealed that McKeon had recently made changes to his will. The updated document left a significant portion of his estate to a charitable foundation he had founded years earlier, which focused on helping underprivileged children in the city. However, what caught the attention of law enforcement was the fact that McKeon's wife, Veronica, was excluded from receiving any financial support in the event of his death. This was a stark contrast to McKeon's previous will, in which his wife stood to inherit the majority of his wealth. The change raised suspicions that there might have been a financial motive for murder, and investigators began to dig deeper into the McKeon family's finances. As detectives pieced together the evidence, it became increasingly clear that McKeon's life had been filled with secrecy, betrayal, and power struggles. His business empire, which had made him millions, was built on alliances that often turned sour. His personal life, too, was full of complex relationships, his troubled marriage, his connections to shady business partners, and his questionable moral decisions. As investigators continued to follow the leads, they realized that the murder of Robert McKeon was more than just a case of greed or revenge. It was a complex web of lies, deceit, and ambition. In the following days, the case continued to evolve, and detectives began to uncover more clues. Veronica McKeon's financial troubles, including her gambling debts and her involvement in questionable investments, painted a picture of a woman who might have been desperate enough to resort to extreme measures. However, there was still no clear evidence pointing directly to her involvement in the murder. Likewise, Mark Graves and Lisa Turner, despite their possible motives, maintained their innocence. The investigation into Robert McKeon's death would continue for weeks, and it would soon become apparent that the search for the truth was far from straightforward. The case also raised important questions about the lengths to which individuals were willing to go to maintain their power and control, whether in the business world or within the confines of personal relationships. It was a stark reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that behind the glamorous facade of wealth and success, there often lay a darker, more dangerous reality. As the investigation unfolded, the public began to realize that McKeon's death was not just a tragic event, but a reflection of the ruthless and often treacherous world in which he had thrived. The investigation into Robert McKeon's murder intensified as law enforcement delved deeper into his life and the many people who had crossed paths with him. Detectives began by examining McKeon's business dealings, which were as vast and complicated as his personal relationships. His real estate empire had been built on risky investments, often involving shady dealings and murky partnerships. McKeon was known for playing hardball, and it wasn't uncommon for him to use aggressive tactics to force others out of deals that he had set his eyes on. A number of his former partners had fallen on hard times after McKeon had either outbid them or taken credit for their ideas. This led investigators to consider the possibility that McKeon's murder was not a crime of passion, but a carefully planned retaliation by one of his disgruntled partners. Among the many potential suspects was Mark Graves, McKeon's former business partner, who had been forced out of a lucrative deal just months before the murder. Graves was not only financially devastated by the break, but he had also lost the respect of many in the business world due to McKeon's public disparagement of him. Investigators discovered that Graves had been seeking revenge for what he saw as a betrayal. His social media posts, interviews, and financial statements painted a picture of a man with both the means and the motive to act against McKeon. Graves had publicly accused McKeon of underhanded business practices, and there were rumors that he had made threats about McKeon's future in the industry. Graves' alibi, however, was solid. On the night of the murder, he had been in his office working late on a project that was expected to bring in a significant amount of revenue. His phone records corroborated this, showing that he had made several business calls throughout the evening. Although his motive for revenge was clear, the physical evidence failed to link him to the crime scene. His fingerprints were not found at McKeon's apartment, and there were no signs of forced entry. It appeared that if Graves were involved, he had either hired someone to carry out the murder or had somehow found a way to evade detection. Next on the list of suspects was Lisa Turner, McKeon's personal assistant. Turner was not only a trusted employee, but also someone who had been by McKeon's side for years. Investigators found it strange that she had been the last person to see McKeon alive, yet her alibi was unsubstantiated. Turner claimed to have been at home with her fiancé, but no one could verify her whereabouts with certainty. Her relationship with McKeon had always been professional, or so it seemed. But there were whispers among McKeon's colleagues that Turner may have been more involved in her boss's life than anyone knew. A few weeks before the murder, Turner had requested a significant raise, and McKeon had turned her down, which had led to tension between them. Some believed that Turner's request for a raise had stemmed from a deeper frustration with her personal situation. Others speculated that she had been infatuated with McKeon and had hoped that he would reciprocate her feelings, a theory supported by her emotional outbursts during the police interview. Detectives also looked into Turner's financial records and found that she had made several unusual transactions. Small but frequent deposits had been made to her bank account, which investigators initially thought could be linked to her personal relationships or debts. Upon further examination, they discovered that some of these transactions originated from offshore accounts, which was highly suspicious. Turner had also been spending large sums of money, buying expensive items such as jewelry and designer clothes. It was clear that she had been living beyond her means. When asked about these expenses, Turner claimed that the money was a gift from her fiancé, but investigators could not find any evidence of these gifts in her fiancé's financial statements. This raised further questions about her involvement in the crime. Turner's motive seemed to be both financial and emotional. If McKeon had indeed been the person who had hurt her financially by denying her request for a raise, it was possible that Turner saw the murder as a way to end her dependency on him and to secure her future. Furthermore, if there had been any romantic feelings on Turner's part that had gone unrequited, it might have fueled a sense of betrayal and resentment. However, without physical evidence linking her to the crime, detectives struggled to prove her guilt. As the weeks passed and new information came to light, Veronica McKeon, Robert's wife, became an increasingly important focus of the investigation. While it was widely known that the couple's marriage had been rocky for years, it was equally clear that Robert had made a dramatic change to his will just weeks before his death, cutting Veronica out of his estate entirely. This sudden shift in his financial plans raised suspicions that she may have had a strong motive for murder. Veronica had a history of gambling problems and had accumulated a significant amount of debt, which had reportedly caused tension in the marriage. It was rumored that McKeon had threatened to divorce her if she did not seek help for her addiction, but she had refused. In the weeks leading up to McKeon's death, Veronica had been seen at several high-end casinos, and her financial transactions revealed a troubling pattern of significant losses. Veronica's alibi was weak. She claimed to have been at a friend's house during the time of the murder, but no one could verify her whereabouts. What was more telling was her reaction when police initially questioned her about Robert's death. Veronica seemed unfazed, almost too calm for someone who had just lost her husband. Her behavior seemed off to the detectives, and they couldn't help but feel that she was hiding something. Veronica's failure to display grief was later noted by colleagues who had worked with her. Despite this, there was no direct evidence that she had been involved in her husband's death. Detectives soon learned that Veronica had been in contact with an attorney in the days before Robert's murder. The lawyer, when questioned, revealed that Veronica had been discussing the terms of her divorce and had inquired about how she could legally secure a large portion of Robert's estate. The lawyer also mentioned that Veronica had been frustrated by the fact that Robert had not made arrangements for her in his will, especially given their long history together. This revelation painted a clear picture of a woman who might have been driven by greed and desperation. As the investigation continued, forensic experts analyzed the crime scene and the evidence collected from Robert McKeon's apartment. The gun used in the shooting was a rare type, and police traced it to a local gun store where it had been sold to an unregistered buyer just weeks before the murder. Surveillance footage from nearby security cameras showed a man wearing a hooded jacket entering the building around the time of the murder, though his face was obscured. This person had been seen leaving the building shortly after the crime, and investigators worked to identify him by comparing his appearance to the list of known associates of McKeon and his family. The mystery deepened as forensic analysis revealed traces of a unique type of gunpowder residue found on Lisa Turner's clothing, a detail that could not easily be explained. But the biggest break came when new evidence surfaced about a series of phone calls that had been made from McKeon's phone just hours before his death. The calls had been directed to a number that belonged to a known criminal associate who had ties to McKeon's business dealings. This led investigators to believe that the murder was the result of a calculated business dispute that had spiraled out of control. As detectives dug deeper into the mysterious phone calls made from Robert McKeon's phone before his death, they discovered a critical link that pointed to a much darker side of McKeon's business dealings. The number he had dialed belonged to none other than Victor Choi, a notorious figure in New York's underground network. Choi was well known in the city for his involvement in illegal activities, including loan sharking, money laundering, and running an illicit gambling ring. His reputation was built on fear and manipulation, and many in the business world considered him to be someone you didn't want to cross. McKeon's connection to Choi had been well hidden, carefully maintained as a business arrangement that allowed both men to profit from ventures that, on paper, seemed legitimate. What investigators hadn't known, however, was that the relationship between McKeon and Choi had soured in the months leading up to the murder. The two men had been involved in a high-stakes real estate deal involving a piece of prime property in Manhattan. McKeon had been backing the deal with Choi's money, but complications arose when McKeon attempted to cut Choi out of the profits. Choi was not a man who took betrayal lightly. The more detectives uncovered about this business fallout, the clearer it became that McKeon's financial situation was much more precarious than anyone had initially thought. The deal with Choi had gone bad, and McKeon had apparently underestimated the extent of Choi's reach and power. It turned out that Robert McKeon had been trying to sever ties with Choi and extricate himself from the illegal aspects of his business dealings. This, however, did not sit well with Choi, who saw McKeon as a useful ally in his criminal operations. Choi believed that McKeon had betrayed him, and it was evident that McKeon's sudden desire to distance himself from these unsavory connections could have led Choi to take drastic measures. Investigators found that McKeon had made several calls to Choi's associates in the days leading up to his death, seeking a way out of the criminal underworld while keeping his business empire intact. One of the most critical pieces of evidence in this web of deceit was a wire transfer that had been made from McKeon's account to one of Choi's shell companies, a sum of money that McKeon had intended to use as a buyout for Choi's involvement in his business. The transfer was timed just a few days before McKeon's death, and it was a clear indication that McKeon had been trying to make peace with Choi in a last-ditch effort to avoid retribution. However, it appeared that Choi had already made up his mind. McKeon's plan to sever the financial tie was simply too late. As investigators pieced together the final moments leading up to McKeon's murder, they learned that the phone call McKeon had made to Choi was not an isolated event. In fact, McKeon had arranged to meet Choi on the night of his death, in a final attempt to settle their differences. This meeting was scheduled to take place in McKeon's penthouse apartment, and it was clear that McKeon had hoped to negotiate a deal that would allow him to escape Choi's grip. The meeting, however, never took place. Instead, it seemed that Choi had sent one of his enforcers to McKeon's apartment to ensure that the deal would not be finalized. One of Choi's trusted men, a hitman by the name of Ivan, the Hammer Petrov, had been dispatched to make sure that McKeon wouldn't walk away from the deal. Petrov, a Russian national with a history of violent criminal acts, had a reputation for carrying out his assignments with brutal efficiency. His methods were well known in the criminal underworld, and he was feared for his ability to eliminate targets without leaving a trace. The hitman was the one who had entered McKeon's apartment that fateful night, under the guise of a business associate. Evidence recovered from the scene showed that McKeon had attempted to defend himself, but it was clear that Petrov was both skilled and well prepared. The struggle between the two men had been violent, but ultimately McKeon had been overpowered. The gunshot that killed him had been fired at point-blank range, and the angle of the shot indicated that McKeon had not been expecting the attack. Petrov had left the apartment quickly, knowing that the job was done. He had removed all traces of his presence, and McKeon's assistant had arrived just after the killer had fled, discovering the grisly scene moments later. The discovery of Ivan Petrov's involvement in the murder was a breakthrough in the investigation, but it didn't bring immediate closure. Authorities needed to find Petrov and bring him to justice. They quickly discovered that Petrov had disappeared, vanishing into the criminal network that spanned both New York and international borders. Choi, for his part, had gone underground as well, likely fearing that his own involvement in the murder would be exposed. With both Choi and Petrov on the run, investigators faced the challenge of locating them and gathering enough evidence to secure an indictment. As the search for Choi and Petrov intensified, law enforcement worked closely with international agencies to track their movements. It wasn't long before they learned that Choi had fled to Asia, possibly to one of his known hideouts in Hong Kong or Macau. Petrov, meanwhile, had reportedly been spotted in Europe, though his exact whereabouts were difficult to trace. It became clear that McKeon's murder was not just a local crime, but part of a much larger network of illegal activities that spanned continents. The case against Veronica McKeon, Robert's wife, continued to evolve as well. Despite the growing evidence against Choi and Petrov, law enforcement remained cautious about ruling her out entirely. Veronica's financial records, combined with her lack of emotional response to Robert's death, made her an ongoing person of interest. In the end, investigators concluded that Veronica's role in her husband's death had been indirect. While she may have been motivated by greed and desperation, it was clear that Choi and Petrov were the masterminds behind the murder. Veronica was eventually charged with conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to several years in prison. But the focus of the investigation remained on Choi and Petrov, who had orchestrated the violent act from the shadows. Months later, the international manhunt for Victor Choi and Ivan Petrov reached a critical point when Choi was captured in Hong Kong, while Petrov remained elusive. The capture of Choi provided the breakthrough that investigators needed to close the case. In an attempt to secure a lighter sentence, Choi confessed to orchestrating McKeon's murder, providing authorities with crucial details that allowed them to piece together the full scope of the plot. Petrov, however, remained a fugitive, and the hunt for him continued. The murder of Robert McKeon had shaken the business world, exposing the dangerous ties between legitimate business operations and the criminal underworld. The case served as a stark reminder of the lengths people would go to protect their wealth and power, and the deadly consequences that could result from betrayal and greed. As the investigation drew to a close, the story of Robert McKeon's death became one of the most talked-about criminal cases in the history of New York City, a tragic tale of ambition, deception, and the harsh realities of a world that often valued success above all else. Story 9. On the morning of July 18, 2015, the small town of Aberdeen, South Dakota, was shaken to its core by the shocking disappearance of 10-year-old Emily Anderson. She had been walking to a friend's house just a few blocks away, as she did every Saturday morning, excited to spend the day with her best friend, Megan. Emily's parents, Sarah and David Anderson, had been busy preparing for a family outing, and Emily's departure had been a simple, routine event. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but when Megan's mother called Sarah later that afternoon to ask why Emily had never shown up, the quiet suburban neighborhood turned frantic. The Andersons immediately began calling around to check if Emily had made it to her friend's house. Sarah contacted the local police as soon as it became clear that Emily hadn't arrived, and a search for the missing girl was quickly launched. The entire town mobilized, with volunteers scouring the streets, canvassing local businesses, and speaking to neighbors. The police launched an investigation and began reviewing security footage from nearby stores, hoping to spot Emily walking to her destination. Within hours, it was clear that this was not a simple case of a child getting lost or wandering off. The police began to consider the possibility of foul play when surveillance video from a convenience store nearby showed a dark-colored van slowing down near Emily as she was walking on the sidewalk. The video showed a man with a hooded sweatshirt leaning out of the passenger window, speaking to her briefly before she was seen walking closer to the vehicle. Moments later, the video showed Emily walking out of the frame, but the van remained in the area for several more minutes before speeding off in the opposite direction. The footage was grainy and didn't capture the face of the man, but it was enough to send alarm bells ringing in the investigation. Detective Brian Carter, a seasoned investigator with the Aberdeen Police Department, was assigned to lead the case. He reviewed the video carefully and noted the movements of the van. The vehicle had clearly been waiting for Emily. It wasn't a random event. The man in the van, though his identity was still unknown, seemed to be targeting her specifically. Detective Carter quickly made the decision to put out an Amber Alert across the state. News outlets were notified, and local schools were informed about the case in case there were any further sightings of Emily. The Andersons were devastated, and their worst fears began to take shape. Their daughter had been abducted. The next day, the first clue in the case arrived, but it was unsettling. At 2 a.m., Sarah Anderson's phone rang. When she answered, a deep, gravelly voice came through the receiver. The man on the other end of the line was calm, but there was a menacing undertone to his voice. He claimed to have Emily and demanded a large sum of money for her safe return. He didn't provide specific details about where she was being held, but he warned Sarah that if they went to the police, Emily would be harmed. The caller hung up before Sarah could respond. The police traced the call, but it had been made from a disposable prepaid phone, leaving no traceable location. Despite the lack of details, the authorities were able to act quickly. They enlisted the help of the FBI, who sent a team of experts to work alongside local law enforcement. The initial hope was that they could track down the phone number and perhaps use it to pinpoint Emily's location. However, the suspect seemed to have been careful, covering his tracks. He made additional calls over the next few days, each time demanding more money, with no further clues about Emily's whereabouts. The calls were always short, with no room for negotiation, and each time, the voice on the other end was the same. It was becoming clear that this was not an amateur operation. The man had experience with this type of crime. As the days passed, the Anderson family became increasingly desperate. Sarah spent hours on the phone with the police, pleading for them to find her daughter, while David began working with a private investigator, desperate to uncover any new leads. Emily's case was getting national attention, and the entire community had come together to help. But the days turned into weeks with no progress. The abductors seemed to be one step ahead at every turn. Meanwhile, Detective Carter and his team worked tirelessly, examining every possible lead. They scoured over the footage from the convenience store, hoping for a breakthrough. Finally, after several days of combing through the video and interviewing witnesses, they were able to find a breakthrough. A man, who was seen briefly on a security camera outside a gas station near where Emily had been abducted, appeared to be getting into the van right before it sped off. He had been wearing a baseball cap and dark clothing, but it was enough for the police to start narrowing down a suspect. Through a combination of witness statements and tracking down vehicles in the area, police were able to identify the man in the video as Thomas Hayes, a 38-year-old man with a criminal record. Hayes had been previously arrested for assault, but there were no records of him being involved in child abductions. However, his recent activity had raised some suspicions. His phone records were found to have been linked to the same disposable phones that had been used to contact the Andersons. Detective Carter quickly learned that Hayes had been living in a small rural town several hours away from Aberdeen, where he had recently been evicted from his apartment due to an undisclosed legal dispute. Law enforcement moved quickly to track Hayes down, searching his known locations and speaking to his neighbors. After a tense few days of searching, authorities were able to locate his vehicle parked outside a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment (CARD) team was deployed to assist in the search, and they organized a raid on the house where Hayes was suspected to be hiding. When officers entered the house, they found the basement door locked. They broke it down and, to their relief, discovered Emily alive but in a state of shock. She had been kept in a small, windowless room, bound to a chair. While she was physically unharmed, it was clear that she had been traumatized by her ordeal. The authorities immediately took her to a hospital for medical evaluation and to ensure her well-being. As for Thomas Hayes, he was arrested on charges of kidnapping, child endangerment, and several counts of assault. During his interrogation, Hayes confessed to abducting Emily, though his motives remained unclear. He claimed he had been following orders from a mysterious figure, but he refused to reveal any further details. Detective Carter continued to investigate Hayes's connections, hoping to uncover the full story behind the abduction and whether he had any accomplices. The case was far from over, and while the Andersons were reunited with their daughter, the lasting effects of the crime would haunt them for years to come. The town of Aberdeen, once filled with peace and security, was forever marked by the kidnapping of Emily Anderson, a case that would leave a lasting scar on a community that never expected something so terrible to occur. The events of that summer would continue to ripple through their lives as the investigation into Thomas Hayes unfolded, revealing dark secrets that no one could have anticipated. In the days following the discovery of Emily's whereabouts, the investigation into Thomas Hayes deepened. The community, though relieved by the safe return of the young girl, was still gripped by the lingering fear that someone so dangerous had been hiding in their midst. While Emily's family focused on her recovery, the authorities continued to piece together the puzzle that led to her abduction. Hayes, having been taken into custody, was now under the watchful eyes of detectives, and every detail of his life was scrutinized. Hayes, however, was an enigma. His past wasn't filled with violent crimes, at least not in a way that would have prepared the police for such an act. He had been arrested a few times over the years, mostly for minor assaults and petty crimes, but nothing suggested he would be capable of such a calculated and disturbing act of abduction. He was often described by his few acquaintances as a loner, someone who kept to himself, rarely engaging with others. His neighbors had reported that he was somewhat reclusive, but that there was nothing particularly odd about him. Yet, as Detective Carter and his team dug deeper, it became clear that Hayes's involvement in the kidnapping wasn't as simple as it first appeared. As investigators began questioning Hayes about the abduction, they were struck by his demeanor. He was calm, almost too calm, and his responses were often vague and evasive. When asked why he had taken Emily, Hayes initially claimed he didn't know. He said that he had been following orders from someone else, someone who had promised him a large sum of money in exchange for helping them with their plans. But when pressed further, Hayes clammed up, refusing to provide any more details about his supposed accomplice. Hayes's reluctance to speak only deepened the mystery, and Detective Carter felt a growing sense of frustration. The case seemed to be taking unexpected twists, and Carter's intuition told him that there was more to this than just a simple kidnapping gone wrong. Was Hayes a mere pawn in a much larger operation, or was he the mastermind behind it all? The detective couldn't shake the feeling that someone else, a shadowy figure operating behind the scenes, had orchestrated this crime. To find answers, Carter began reviewing Hayes's personal history, looking for any connections that might explain his sudden, bizarre behavior. He discovered that Hayes had recently been living in a state of near poverty, barely scraping by, and that he had been evicted from his apartment just a month before the abduction. There was a sense of desperation in his life, but it didn't explain his actions. What had pushed Hayes to commit such a crime, and why had he chosen Emily, a seemingly random child from a suburban neighborhood? Detective Carter needed answers, and to get them, he would have to dig deeper into Hayes's life. One evening, after hours of relentless questioning, Hayes finally cracked. His voice shook slightly as he recounted what had led him to abduct Emily, though his story was hard to believe at first. According to Hayes, he had been approached by a man named Michael Walsh, a figure from his past who had seemingly come out of nowhere. Walsh was someone Hayes had known years ago, someone who had always been involved in shady dealings. Hayes claimed that Walsh had tracked him down and offered him a deal, help him with a job, and in return, Hayes would be paid enough money to turn his life around. The job, as Hayes later explained, was to abduct a young girl, Emily Anderson, whose parents had significant wealth. Walsh had told Hayes that the Anderson family would pay a large ransom for their daughter's return, and that the money would be split between them. At first, Hayes had been reluctant. He didn't want to get involved in something that could land him back in prison, but Walsh had been persistent. He had shown Hayes that the Andersons were vulnerable, that they had money, and that this would be an easy opportunity for both of them. Hayes, in his weakened state, had eventually agreed, his mind clouded by the promise of a fresh start. As he spoke, Hayes described how he had watched Emily for several days before the abduction. He had kept an eye on her routine, when she left for her friend's house, when she would return, and where she typically walked. It became apparent to him that she would be the perfect target, and once he made the decision to go through with it, everything seemed to fall into place. The plan, according to Hayes, had been meticulously set up by Walsh, who had even instructed him on what to do once Emily was taken. Hayes was to hold her in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place no one would look. Walsh had assured him that the ransom money would come soon enough. Detective Carter listened intently as Hayes detailed how he had waited for the right moment, following Emily on the morning of July 18th. The van, he explained, had been a key part of the plan. It was a vehicle that Walsh had provided for him, along with the phone he had used to make contact with the Anderson family. Hayes recounted how he had pulled up alongside Emily and engaged her in conversation, telling her that her parents had asked him to give her a ride. Emily, ever the trusting child, had climbed into the van without hesitation. It wasn't until she was inside that Hayes realized the enormity of what he had done. Once Emily was in the van, Hayes described feeling a mix of fear and guilt. He hadn't intended to hurt her, but the situation quickly spiraled out of control. He drove her to the house Walsh had instructed him to, where he locked her in the basement, alone and frightened. Despite his growing unease, Hayes followed Walsh's orders, making the phone calls to the Andersons and demanding the ransom. He told the family he would not release Emily unless they paid the large sum of money he had specified. Detective Carter could see the guilt in Hayes's eyes as he spoke, but it was clear that Hayes's involvement in the crime was more than just an act of desperation. He had made a choice, albeit a tragic one, and had played an active role in the kidnapping. However, Carter was still left with many unanswered questions. If Hayes had been acting on Walsh's instructions, then where was Walsh? Who was this mysterious figure pulling the strings? As Carter left the interrogation room that night, he felt a renewed sense of urgency. The discovery of Michael Walsh's role in the abduction was now the key to solving the case. With Hayes's confession in hand, the investigation turned to tracking down Walsh, and Detective Carter knew that finding him was the next crucial step in uncovering the full extent of the crime. However, Walsh had disappeared as quickly as Hayes had, and the clock was ticking, not only for the sake of the investigation, but also for the safety of other potential victims who may still be under Walsh's influence. As Detective Carter and his team moved forward with their search for Michael Walsh, the sense of urgency grew more palpable. Time was not on their side, and every hour that passed seemed to bring them closer to a breakthrough, or potentially another tragedy. The confession from Thomas Hayes had provided a critical lead, but Walsh was still an enigma. Who was this man, and why was he so elusive? Had he disappeared entirely, or was he still in the area, watching, waiting? Detective Carter couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation, knowing that the fate of the case rested on tracking down this mysterious figure. The investigation into Walsh's background revealed little at first. Hayes had spoken about him in vague terms, describing him as a figure from his past who had fallen off the radar for several years. But Carter's instincts told him that Walsh wasn't just some random criminal. There was something more to him, something that made him particularly dangerous. Carter began to focus on Walsh's possible connections to organized crime. It was a gut feeling, but the more the team delved into Walsh's past, the more it seemed plausible. He had lived in several states across the country, each time making an appearance in towns that were known for having a high concentration of criminal activity. Through their search, investigators learned that Walsh had a history of involvement in shady dealings, small-time scams, blackmail, and even connections to illegal gambling rings. But there was one thing that stood out. He had a reputation for being meticulous, a master manipulator who could convince people to do his bidding. It was becoming clearer that Hayes was likely one of many individuals that Walsh had used over the years, exploiting their weaknesses for his own gain. As Carter's team continued to analyze every piece of information they could find on Walsh, they realized that they had overlooked something crucial. Walsh had likely been monitoring the investigation closely, aware that the police were closing in on him. The detective also found that the abduction of Emily Anderson wasn't the first time Walsh had orchestrated something like this. There were signs of similar patterns in other areas, involving other victims. It was as though Walsh was testing the waters, refining his strategy, preparing for something bigger. Detective Carter knew that he needed to act fast. He intensified the search for Walsh, enlisting the help of federal law enforcement and expanding their search to nearby states. They issued alerts in multiple jurisdictions, hoping that someone somewhere had seen something that would lead them to Walsh. Yet, despite their best efforts, the man remained elusive. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of his whereabouts. With each passing day, the case felt colder, but Carter refused to give up. One day, nearly 2 weeks after Emily's return, a tip came in. It was an anonymous call to the local police station, claiming to have information on Michael Walsh's location. The caller, who identified himself as an acquaintance of Walsh, provided the detectives with a specific address, a house located in a rural part of Nebraska, just across the border. The man said he had seen Walsh in the area recently, and although he hadn't spoken to him directly, he had overheard a conversation that seemed suspicious. The caller mentioned seeing Walsh with a bag of money and hinted at plans for another job. Though he didn't know the details, Carter was cautious. Was this a legitimate lead or another dead end? The fact that Walsh had been laying low for so long made it hard to believe he'd be so careless as to stay in one place. Still, the tip was worth investigating. With the help of the FBI, Carter and his team prepared to make their move. They meticulously planned the operation, hoping that this time they would catch Walsh off guard. They arrived at the address in the early hours of the morning, just before dawn. The area was quiet, with only the distant hum of vehicles on the highway. As Carter and his team surrounded the house, they noticed the eerie stillness. It didn't look like anyone was home, but Carter wasn't ready to give up just yet. He ordered his team to proceed with caution, ready for anything. After a few tense moments of waiting, they made their move. The door to the house was kicked in, and officers flooded the interior. They found the house deserted. There were signs that someone had recently been there. Dirty dishes on the kitchen counter, clothes strewn across the floor, and a half-empty cup of coffee on the table. But Michael Walsh was nowhere to be found. It seemed like he had anticipated the raid, disappearing once again before the police could get to him. The disappointment was palpable. Walsh had slipped away once more, and the frustration that had been building inside Carter finally began to show. He was determined to catch this man, but it felt like the harder he tried, the more elusive Walsh became. It was a game of cat and mouse, and for now, it seemed that Walsh had won yet another round. Days turned into weeks, and the case continued to drag on. Despite the police's best efforts, Walsh remained a ghost. Detective Carter, however, knew that Walsh couldn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, he would make a mistake. In the meantime, the investigation continued, with new leads and new faces appearing on the radar. As the pressure mounted, Carter made a decision to intensify the search. He wouldn't rest until Walsh was found. In the following months, the case gained national attention, with every update reported in the media. The Anderson family, although relieved that their daughter was safe, continued to live in fear, knowing that the man who had taken Emily was still out there, plotting his next move. Emily herself, while healing physically, struggled emotionally. The trauma of what had happened to her would stay with her for years to come, leaving scars that time might not fully erase. Detective Carter's team remained committed, chasing every lead, re-interviewing witnesses, and going over evidence with a fine-tooth comb. They worked tirelessly, not just for the Andersons, but for the countless others who might fall victim to Walsh's manipulative ways if he were left free. And then one day, almost 6 months after Emily's abduction, a breakthrough came. An anonymous tip, similar to the first one, came through the wire. This time, the tipster claimed that Walsh had been seen at a remote cabin in the mountains of Colorado. Carter wasn't about to let this slip away. He and his team mobilized once more, and this time, they were determined to catch Walsh once and for all. This time, they were ready. Detective Carter wasn't going to let this criminal slip through his fingers again. This time, Walsh's luck would run out. Story 10. In 2015, a chilling murder case rocked the city of Manila, Philippines, leaving the community in disbelief. The victim, a 28-year-old woman named Maria Santos, was found dead under mysterious and disturbing circumstances. Maria had been a well-known figure in the local neighborhood, a young woman with a bright future, working as a nurse at a nearby hospital. Her family described her as kind, responsible, and dedicated to her career, always looking out for others. But on a fateful night in November, her life was cut short in a brutal manner that left investigators with more questions than answers. The police were called to the scene when Maria's neighbors noticed her apartment door left ajar, which was unusual for someone as careful and organized as Maria. Concerned, they went inside and discovered her lifeless body lying on the floor of the living room, blood staining the carpet. The scene was chaotic, furniture was overturned, and there were signs of a struggle, suggesting that Maria had tried to defend herself before she was killed. Her phone was missing, and there were no obvious signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe that the killer was someone Maria knew. But who? Detective Ernesto Reyes, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving high-profile cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. As he arrived at the crime scene, he was struck by the eerie calmness that seemed to hang in the air, despite the brutality of the crime. He knew this case would be challenging, but something about it felt different. Maria's death didn't seem to fit any of the usual motives he had seen in his years on the force. There were no signs of robbery, and her belongings appeared untouched. Reyes suspected that the killer's motive was something more personal, but the details remained frustratingly elusive. The first step was to gather information about Maria's life. Detective Reyes and his team interviewed her family, friends, and colleagues. They learned that Maria had been living alone in the apartment, having recently ended a long-term relationship with a man named Rafael Torres. Rafael, a businessman in his early 30s, was described as charming and ambitious, but his relationship with Maria had become strained in the months leading up to her death. Friends and family revealed that the two had been having ongoing arguments, mainly over Rafael's controlling behavior and jealousy, which had begun to take a toll on Maria's well-being. Detective Reyes quickly identified Rafael as a prime suspect. The relationship between the two had ended bitterly, and there were reports of emotional abuse. Maria's friends recalled incidents where Rafael would show up uninvited to her apartment, confront her about her social life, and accuse her of being unfaithful. Maria had confided in her close friends about feeling trapped in the relationship, and there were even rumors that she had started seeing someone new. This only seemed to fuel Rafael's anger and resentment. Rafael was brought in for questioning. His demeanor during the interrogation was calm, even aloof, as he denied any involvement in Maria's death. He claimed to have been at a business meeting at the time of her murder and presented an alibi, which was corroborated by several of his colleagues. However, Detective Reyes wasn't convinced. The more he questioned Rafael, the more he began to notice small inconsistencies in his story. Rafael's calmness seemed too rehearsed, and there was an underlying sense of defensiveness in his tone, as if he were trying to hide something. Reyes pressed him further, but Rafael stuck to his alibi, denying that he had any reason to harm Maria. Despite his initial suspicions, Reyes knew better than to make assumptions based solely on emotional tension. He decided to dig deeper into the relationship between Maria and Rafael, hoping that there would be a more tangible lead that could link him to the crime. Reyes ordered a thorough forensic investigation of Maria's apartment and her personal belongings, and soon, a small but crucial piece of evidence emerged. A set of fingerprints, belonging to Rafael Torres, was found on the handle of Maria's front door. While this alone was not definitive proof of his guilt, it was enough to warrant a closer examination of Rafael's involvement. As the investigation continued, Detective Reyes also discovered a new lead, Maria's phone. Though it was missing from the crime scene, records from the phone company indicated that it had been used the night of the murder, shortly after Maria's death. The phone's last known location had been traced to a location near Rafael's office, suggesting that he may have been in the vicinity when Maria was killed. When Reyes confronted Rafael with this information, his composure began to falter. For the first time, he seemed rattled, but he quickly regained his composure and insisted that someone must have stolen Maria's phone. Reyes, sensing that they were closing in on the truth, decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing solely on Rafael, he turned his attention to the broader context of Maria's life. He began to investigate her work environment, speaking with colleagues and examining her daily routine. It was there that Reyes uncovered a surprising detail. Maria had been involved in a hospital charity event just days before her death, an event that had attracted significant attention from local media. Maria had been one of the key organizers of the event, and her work had earned her praise from both her colleagues and the community. However, the charity event also shed light on another aspect of Maria's life that had gone unnoticed by her family and friends: her growing involvement with a donor named Carlos Delgado. Delgado was a wealthy businessman with connections to the healthcare industry, and he had made large contributions to the charity. Maria and Carlos had been seen together on several occasions at the event, and there were whispers among the staff that the two had developed a close friendship. Some of her colleagues even hinted that the relationship might have become romantic. Detective Reyes couldn't ignore this new lead. While Rafael remained the primary suspect, the possibility of a love triangle involving Carlos Delgado couldn't be dismissed. Reyes interviewed Carlos, and while he appeared genuinely distressed over Maria's death, something about his demeanor raised a red flag. Carlos was cooperative during the questioning, but seemed to downplay the depth of his relationship with Maria. He insisted that they had only been friends, but Reyes wasn't sure. There was something about Carlos's reactions that felt like he was hiding something. As Reyes followed this new line of inquiry, he started to piece together the complex web of relationships surrounding Maria's death. Was Rafael truly the one behind her murder, driven by jealousy and anger, or was there another motive at play? The investigation was no longer just about one man's obsession. It was about uncovering the truth behind a tangled web of emotions, power, and deceit. It was clear to Reyes that this case was far from simple, and as the pieces began to fall into place, he knew that solving it would require more than just following the obvious leads. Detective Reyes knew that the case had many layers, and unraveling each one would require persistence and careful investigation. He had already spent hours combing through the evidence and the relationships that surrounded Maria. Now, with the potential involvement of Carlos Delgado, he could sense that they were on the brink of uncovering something far darker than they had originally imagined. While Rafael Torres had remained at the center of suspicion, the discovery of Maria's involvement with Delgado shifted the focus of the investigation. Reyes could not ignore the possibility that Carlos Delgado's connection with Maria had been more than just friendly. After all, the large financial contributions he had made to the charity event, the numerous meetings they had shared, and the undeniable chemistry they seemed to have were all pieces of the puzzle. Could it be that Delgado's feelings toward Maria had evolved into something more? And if so, how did Rafael Torres, with his possessive and controlling nature, factor into it? Reyes revisited the charity event where Maria had worked closely with Delgado. Interviews with event organizers, volunteers, and participants painted a picture of Maria as a dedicated and admired figure within her community. She was passionate about her work at the hospital and had always been ready to lend a helping hand. Yet, as Reyes dug deeper into her interactions with Carlos Delgado, he began to see the first hints of tension that might have been brewing under the surface. Several of the event's volunteers mentioned that Maria had become more withdrawn in the days leading up to the murder. She had seemed distracted and distant, as though she were dealing with personal issues that weighed heavily on her. Some even reported that there had been instances where Maria appeared to have an argument with Delgado, although no one had witnessed it directly. It was clear to Reyes that something had changed between them, perhaps a misunderstanding or a deeper conflict that neither of them had shared with others. Maria's colleagues were tight-lipped about the nature of their relationship, but Reyes suspected that these tensions had festered over time, culminating in the tragic events that led to her death. Further investigation revealed that Maria had, in fact, been in contact with Delgado on the evening of her murder. Her phone records showed a series of calls and messages exchanged between the two just hours before she was killed. However, there was a critical gap in the timeline. Maria's phone had gone silent for a period of time that coincided with the estimated time of death. This suggested that something had happened between Maria and Carlos during those hours, and it was likely significant. The question now was, did Delgado play a role in her death, or was he a mere bystander? Detective Reyes ordered another round of questioning, this time with Carlos Delgado. The businessman arrived at the police station with a calm demeanor, his tailored suit and polished appearance in stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. He seemed genuine in his distress over Maria's death, but his answers to the detective's questions were carefully crafted, as if he had rehearsed them. Delgado continued to insist that their relationship had been purely professional and that he had no romantic interest in Maria. However, Reyes couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The businessman's tight control over his emotions, coupled with his reluctance to go into detail about his last interactions with Maria, only fueled the detective's suspicions. Reyes pressed Delgado further, asking pointed questions about the evening of Maria's death. Delgado's alibi, which claimed that he had been at a dinner meeting with business partners, seemed to check out initially. However, as Reyes pointed out, there was a glaring inconsistency. Delgado had mentioned in his previous statement that he had last seen Maria at the charity event 2 days before the murder. But now he was saying that they had spoken later that evening, just hours before she was killed. Delgado stumbled for a moment, caught off guard by the detective's sharp observations. Reyes could sense his discomfort, and the gap in his story became more apparent with every question. The detective also noticed that Delgado seemed unusually fixated on the details of Maria's death. He asked questions that seemed too specific, as if he were trying to learn more about the case than was publicly known. Reyes, ever the experienced investigator, couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that Delgado might be hiding something. His knowledge of the crime scene details, coupled with the inconsistencies in his timeline, suggested that he was not being entirely forthcoming. In the days that followed, Reyes ordered a thorough search of Carlos Delgado's home and office, hoping to uncover something that would tie him more directly to Maria's murder. Delgado's background was scrutinized, and detectives uncovered a troubling pattern. There were whispers in the business community about Delgado's temper and his tendency to become possessive over women he became involved with. Though he had maintained a public image of a respectable businessman, private reports suggested that he had been involved in several heated confrontations over the years, particularly with women who rejected his advances. Among the items recovered from Delgado's office was a journal that appeared to be his own. Its pages contained a series of cryptic entries, many of which seemed to focus on his feelings toward Maria. There were mentions of jealousy, frustration, and a deep longing for her attention. Some entries indicated that he had begun to feel entitled to Maria's affections, despite her attempts to keep their relationship strictly professional. In one particularly disturbing entry, Delgado wrote, "I will make her see that no one else will love her the way I do. No one else can protect her like I can." The words, though seemingly harmless on their own, now took on a much darker tone in the context of her death. Detective Reyes took these findings to the local prosecutor, building a case against Carlos Delgado based on circumstantial evidence and motive. He was still careful not to rule out Rafael Torres entirely, but everything pointed to Delgado as the person who might have had the most to gain from Maria's death. He was the one who had the most to lose: his pride, his control, and his image. The more Reyes thought about it, the clearer it became. Maria had been caught in the crossfire of two men who were unwilling to let go of their desire for her, one driven by jealousy, the other by obsession. With this new information, Reyes knew the case was far from over. There were still unanswered questions, and the investigation was only beginning to scratch the surface of the toxic relationships that had surrounded Maria. The truth would come to light eventually, but for now, Reyes was determined to follow the trail wherever it led, no matter how murky or dangerous it might become. He knew that solving this case would require not just facts, but a deep understanding of the human heart, and the darkness that sometimes lurked within it. Detective Reyes continued to unravel the web of deception that surrounded Maria's death. With each passing day, new pieces of the puzzle fell into place, but there were still many questions that remained unanswered. As he delved deeper into Carlos Delgado's past, the detective found unsettling details that painted a clearer picture of the businessman's psyche. It became increasingly apparent that Delgado's obsession with Maria had taken a dangerous turn. His control over her, coupled with his growing frustration at her rejection, seemed to have pushed him to the brink. The journal entries, which had seemed like harmless musings at first, now appeared to be the ramblings of a man whose mind was slipping into darker territories. Reyes knew that the journal would be a key piece of evidence in the case. It wasn't just the content of the entries that was troubling. It was the fact that Delgado had kept them so meticulously. It was almost as if he were documenting his every move, as though he were justifying his actions to himself. The entries painted a disturbing portrait of a man who believed he was entitled to Maria, someone who couldn't comprehend the boundaries that she had tried to set. "She's mine," one entry read. "I can't let her go. No one can love her like I do." It was clear to Reyes that Delgado had crossed a line from obsession to possessiveness, and that obsession may have cost Maria her life. However, the detective was cautious not to jump to conclusions based solely on this new information. He knew that to secure a conviction, he needed hard evidence linking Delgado directly to the crime. It wasn't enough to rely on a journal or circumstantial evidence. Reyes had to find something concrete that could prove Delgado's involvement beyond a shadow of a doubt. As the investigation continued, Reyes and his team examined the forensic evidence from the crime scene once again. The blood spatter patterns, the signs of a struggle, and the position of Maria's body all told a chilling story. The evidence suggested that Maria had fought valiantly for her life before succumbing to her attacker. But there was one detail that stood out to Reyes: the lack of defensive wounds. Maria had no cuts or bruises on her hands, suggesting that she hadn't raised them in defense. It was almost as though she had been caught off guard, perhaps by someone she trusted. This detail made Reyes pause. Had Maria known her killer? Was it possible that she had let her guard down, believing she was safe with someone she trusted? The detective revisited the security footage from the building where Maria lived. He had already reviewed the tapes once, but this time, he focused on a specific detail: the timestamp of when Maria's phone had last been used. The footage showed Carlos Delgado entering the building's parking garage on the night of the murder. He had arrived at exactly the same time Maria's phone was last active, suggesting that he had been in the area during the time frame when she was killed. The footage was grainy, but Reyes could make out enough to confirm that Delgado had indeed been in the vicinity of Maria's apartment around the time of her death. With this new evidence in hand, Reyes felt the noose tightening around Carlos Delgado. The detective called him in for another round of questioning, this time armed with the security footage and the journal. Delgado's demeanor had begun to change since the first interrogation. Where he had once been confident and composed, he now appeared increasingly agitated, almost defensive. Reyes confronted him with the footage, showing him that he had been in the building the night of the murder. Delgado's reaction was telling. He immediately grew tense, and for a moment his eyes darted to the door, as if searching for a way to escape. But he quickly recovered, denying any involvement in Maria's death. Reyes pressed further, revealing the contents of Delgado's journal. As he read aloud the entries, Delgado's face paled. He fidgeted nervously in his seat, his once calm exterior cracking. "You don't understand," Delgado said, his voice trembling. "She didn't love me the way I loved her. She didn't want me, but I did everything for her. I gave her everything. Why couldn't she see that?" His words were filled with a mix of anger, frustration, and confusion, and it became clear to Reyes that Delgado's emotions had completely clouded his judgment. He was no longer able to see the difference between love and possession. Reyes continued to push, asking Delgado point-blank if he had killed Maria. For a long moment, Delgado remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then, almost as if he had resigned himself to the truth, he looked up and said, "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to see how much I cared. I didn't want anyone else to have her. I thought if I could just make her see, make her understand, we could be together. But when she pushed me away, when she rejected me again, I lost control. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." The confession, though indirect, was enough for Reyes to make the arrest. Delgado had admitted to being in Maria's apartment that night, and his words revealed that he had, in fact, been the one to end her life. The murder was the tragic culmination of a toxic obsession. A man unable to cope with rejection and unable to see that his feelings for Maria were never rooted in love, but in an unhealthy need for control. As Delgado was taken into custody, Reyes couldn't help but reflect on the case. The investigation had revealed the dark side of human emotions, the lengths to which people would go when their desires turned into obsessions, when love became a distorted form of ownership. It was a sobering reminder of the complexity of human relationships and the devastating consequences when they spiral out of control. The trial of Carlos Delgado began several months later. The prosecution presented a strong case, built on the evidence found in his journal, the security footage, and his eventual confession. Delgado was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. While the conviction brought a sense of justice to Maria's family, it did little to ease the pain of their loss. Maria Santos had been a vibrant young woman with a promising future, but in the end, her life was cut short by someone who couldn't let go of his own twisted version of love. For Detective Reyes, the case served as a reminder of the fragility of the human heart and the dangers of unchecked obsession. In the end, justice had been served, but the scars left by Maria's death would linger long after the trial had ended.